I'll put it on you, boy.
Dillian the Body Snatcher Whyte is a heavyweight contender who has been a very popular fan favourite on the British scene over the course of the last decade. Whyte was never a world champion, and he was a mere one-time world heavyweight title challenger. He challenged for Tyson Fury's WBC heavyweight title in April of 2022, and he fell short when he was knocked out by Fury in the 6th round. Now, regardless of how decisively Dillian lost his one and only world title shot, a large section of boxing fans would opine that Dillian's world title shot was long overdue at that point in 2022, due to the wins he had accumulated over the years prior to that shot against Fury. One could argue that Dillian put together a world championship worthy resume long before ever getting a world title shot, and fans sympathised with Dillian's lack of a title shot during the late 2010s and rallied behind him as somebody who was being wronged by the boxing industry by not getting his chance. But some fans refute this claim by deeming Dillian Whyte to be somewhat overrated, rejecting this claim that he's this guy who put together all of these massive wins and he was so hard done by for waiting so long to fight for the WBC strap. Today I'm going to be taking a look at whether or not Dillian Whyte really has put together such a good resume over his career, and whether his resume was so outstanding for a guy who had never fought for a world title, and if his resume is indeed far better than any other one-time world heavyweight title challenger, and possibly even a resume indicative of an actual reigning world heavyweight champion, by the standards of his era. Of course, the reason why he waited so long, that's if you do believe he waited so long, to get a world title shot has everything to do with politics, governing body-wise and promotion-wise. The most pressing issue is the fact that he was famously the WBC #1 ranked contender for a good 3 years and never got his shot at the belt held by Deontay Wilder for most of that time. Fans would accuse Deontay Wilder of ducking Dillian Whyte, and fans would also accuse the WBC of protecting Deontay Wilder, or being complicit with Wilder's team by allowing him to make subpar defences of his WBC heavyweight title, or even ordering subpar defences while Dillian Whyte sat there with the well-earned #1 position. But whether or not we are to sympathise with Dillian Whyte for him supposedly being a victim to boxing politics is not the focus of today's video. Well, not really. Whether or not you think it's his own fault that he didn't go the WBO route instead of the WBC route, or the fact that he was doing business with Eddie Hearn while Hearn was obviously fully focused on Anthony Joshua in regards to the heavyweight division and had Dillian Whyte as an afterthought to matchroom boxing, is somewhat irrelevant to this resume discussion we'll be having here. So when I take you guys through Dillian Whyte's resume, I'm going to try not to focus too much on at what points he was #1 contender, or when Wilder should have given him the shot, or when he should have gone another route in the way of governing body or promoter, or how unlucky he was to be in that circumstance with the WBC. We'll just be looking at the quality of Dillian Whyte's wins, and just the fact that he wasn't fighting for a world title for whatever reason. Dillian Whyte's first real notable pro fight was actually a knockout loss to Anthony Joshua in December of 2015, a fight which was for the British and Commonwealth heavyweight titles, and as aforementioned, Whyte went on to challenge for Tyson Fury's WBC World Heavyweight title in 2022. In regards to resume, I will be going into more detail about the fights on the run that Dillian Whyte went on between the loss to AJ and the loss to Fury, but I will still take a broad look at his whole career. Well, that 6.5-year period between the AJ loss and the Fury loss is basically the main body of Whyte's career. It was the peak of his popularity, and not many boxing fans today will recall or even know about anything that Whyte did before the AJ fight. And in regards to his fights after that run, there is this sort of consensus that his loss to Fury in his first ever world title shot was kind of the end of the road for Whyte, and it was and is too late for him to make another run for a world title. So basically any fight after the Fury fight is kind of irrelevant. So I'm gonna be real. I'm not going to be setting a specific criteria for the quality of each win as I go along. I am just going to kind of yap and opine about how good the wins are. But what I will be taking into consideration in regards to each of Dillian's opponents in this resume analysis is where the opponent was at that point in their career, what those opponents had achieved in their career, how high a risk a fight it was for Dillian Whyte, and I'll kind of go into the whole wins aging well or aging badly discussion for some of the wins, but it will not be a massive determining factor in judging the quality of a win. That thing about how results age is not a definitive way to rate a resume, but talking about how results age is a whole philosophical conversation that maybe we can have in a future video. On top of the fact that we are not focusing his resume on politics very much, we're also not going to be analysing Dillian Whyte's technique or how pretty he looked while boxing here. This ain't about how good or how bad a boxer he was, it's about his resume. However, we will be considering the nature of his wins, i.e. how convincing the decisions were, and how impressive or possibly even unimpressive it was that he knocked out or knocked down certain fighters, based on that opponent's history. Alright, so to take a quick look at Dillian Whyte's professional boxing career prior to the AJ fight, Dillian Whyte had 16 fights before that vacant British title fight against AJ, and there's not any wins in those first 16 fights that does much for Whyte's resume. Not that many heavyweights do fight notable names in their first 16 bouts, and Whyte had even said himself before the AJ fight that he hadn't fought anyone yet. Whyte made his pro debut in May of 2011, and he built his record up to 9-0 until he failed a post-fight drug test after his win over Sandor Balak in October of 2012. Whyte popped for a banned substance called methylhexanamine and was slapped with a 2-year ban. Whyte tried to appeal the ban by saying that he did not knowingly take the banned substance, but an over-the-counter pre-workout that he bought contained the substance without his knowing, but this appeal wasn't enough and the 2-year ban stood. Now, I'm not going to make this whole video about PEDs, so whether you think that Whyte is a brazen, dirty drug cheat, or whether you're of the opinion that everyone's on roids anyway and he was unlucky enough to be made an example of with a 2-year ban, is up to you guys in the comments. His history of drug test failures goes beyond this 2-year ban, of course. But today, I'm of course mainly going to be focusing on Dillian Whyte's resume. And it's not a thing with Dillian Whyte where any of his career wins have been overturned to no contests, so there's no official asterisk over any of his victories. So Whyte came back in November 2014 after his ban was over, and went 15-0 before fighting Brian Minto on the undercard of Anthony Joshua vs Gary Cornish in September of 2015 to set up the grudge match between him and AJ in December. On that night, Whyte stopped Minto in round 3 after Minto just took a knee and kinda sat it out after a left hook that he didn't like. And in the main event, AJ toppled over Gary Cornish in the first round with relative ease. So AJ vs Whyte was live for December. Pre-AJ, the 3 somewhat notable names on Dillian Whyte's resume were Brian Minto, Marcelo Nascimento, and Mike Holden. Both Minto and Nascimento had fought a bunch of big names in the heavyweight division, even cruiserweight for Minto, but they both lost to all of those guys. So yeah, these are more gimme wins than wins that are really good for Whyte's resume. I mean, Minto was coming off of a loss to Israel Adesanya when Whyte fought him. Yes, in boxing. And as for Mike Holden, he is actually a former British heavyweight champion, and Whyte beat Holden in that early stage of his career before the 2-year ban. But Mike Holden was 12 years removed from being the British champ, and he had only fought once in the last 9 years at the point of fighting Whyte. So basically, all of that is a long way of saying that Whyte kinda had no resume pre-AJ. So, Anthony Joshua vs Dillian Whyte, the big British title grudge match that had history behind it after Whyte had defeated AJ in the amateurs back in the day. This was the potential star-making fight for both undefeated guys, and it had a great build-up and all. Now in the ring, Whyte did give a decent account of himself against AJ. AJ did just look the sharper and much crisper of the two in round 1, and Dillian Whyte famously crashed out as a result of a punch landed by AJ just after the bell after that first round. But then in round 2, Whyte would actually rock AJ badly with a left hook. AJ was ostensibly hurt here, he was really shaken. Beauty of heavyweight boxing that. As I said, AJ was just looking the way sharper and crisper of the two here, but Whyte would just swing for the fences to try and intercept while AJ threw shots at him and actually caught him with a good one. AJ made it out of the round, but then Whyte had a pretty decent third round and all, which looked to have him 2-1 up after 3. But AJ did come back into it more in the 4th and won each round from then until the 7th when he started to break Whyte down, and then he stopped him with a big right uppercut. So that's L number 1 of Dillian Whyte's career, to an Anthony Joshua who would remain undefeated for his next 7 fights after that and became a 3-belt unified world heavyweight champion. So not too much shame in that loss for Whyte. It is also common knowledge that Dillian Whyte had a left shoulder injury going into his fight with AJ, and he wasn't in the greatest shape, and his shoulder injury actually worsened when he landed that big left hook on Joshua in the 2nd round. Whyte even underwent shoulder surgery right after the AJ fight. Look, it is what it is here. He took the fight in this shape, and he came up short after his shoulder issues got worse early in the fight. Having a somewhat competitive scrap in which you had a good moment against an undefeated future unified world champion while not being in good nick is not the worst way to lose. But either way, he did lose decisively, and losing efforts do not boost up a guy's resume in my opinion, unless the fight went to the scorecards and there's a big case for the loser winning, i.e. he was robbed. But at the same time, a loss like this does not degrade a guy's resume per se, so the AJ loss is just the AJ loss, I guess. So Whyte's resume did start to build up nicely after the AJ fight, but not right after. Whyte was back in the ring just 6 months after the loss to AJ on the undercard of AJ's first IBF World Heavyweight title defense against Dominic Brazeale. That's the IBF World title that AJ won from Charles Martin in his fight after beating Whyte. Whyte took on former Tony Bellew opponent Ivica Bakarin and stopped Bakarin in the 6th round. This fight was a scheduled 8-rounder against a relatively undersized heavyweight with a bunch of losses who didn't really look like he came to win, so this one does nothing for the resume still. But of course, this was just Whyte's first comeback fight after the loss and the shoulder injury. Now after that win over what I'm comfortable calling the journeyman in Bakarin, things do start to get interesting. This is where talks of Whyte having a decent resume begins. So Dillian Whyte took on an undefeated Dave Allen in July of 2016 in a 10-rounder for the vacant WBC International Heavyweight title, just a month after the Baccarin fight. This was an undefeated Dave Allen, who was yet to do anything in his career. He was 9-0 with one draw, and the draw was not against a noteworthy opponent at all. Allen was coming off of his most notable win going into this fight with Whyte. Dave Allen fought the famous journeyman Jason Gavin, if I may call him that. Gavin had 20 losses, but he did have a winning record, and he'd been in there with Anthony Joshua, Deontay Wilder, and many other notable heavyweight names, of course losing to them all. But this is the type of fight that up-and-coming heavyweights are given. Dave Allen stopped Jason Gavin when Gavin's corner pulled him out after the 4th round. Gavin's corner was saving him from getting himself disqualified after he had been deducted 2 points. And after all the bad boys that he'd fought over the years, Jason Gavin would never box again after the loss to Dave Allen.
I'd go to an island and I'd move there and I'd never box again.
Now that Jason Gavin win that Allen was coming off of wasn't a great performance by any means, and Allen was taking the fight against Dillian Whyte reluctantly on short notice. He did want to fight Dillian Whyte, but he was originally reluctant to take it on as short notice as he did. So Dillian Whyte was a sizable favourite going in against Dave Allen. But Allen was a live opponent. He was a young undefeated fighter who had called Dillian Whyte out in the past, and he was coming to win. Now in the fight, Dillian Whyte would handily and steadily outbox Dave Allen over the 10 rounds to win a wide unanimous decision. One judge had it 100-91, one had it 100-90, that one being a full shutout and probably the accurate card, and the other one had it 99-91. This was a one-sided win from Whyte against an inexperienced Allen, but a motivated Allen in decent shape who was trying to win. Whyte sort of boxed Allen around. He was on his back foot, boxing behind the jab at times, switching stances at times in the first half of the fight, whipping in combinations to the head and body, and beating Allen to the punch for the most part. It wasn't necessarily pretty, it wasn't the best fight, but it was a decisive win for Dillian Whyte. Whyte never really pushed for the stoppage in the fight, nor did he have any big moments where he hurt Dave Allen badly, but he did do a lot of accumulative damage, and there were times in the fight that he was letting his hands go more. So as for how valid this win is, yes, this was a very inexperienced Dave Allen. Whyte had a major experience advantage over Allen. But when it comes to resume talks, the reason why we can end up yapping about someone's resume so much is because you could say so many convoluted things to either really credit or really discredit someone's resume. Oh, when he beat that guy, he had already lost to this guy, and that guy went on a losing streak after he beat him. Or on the other hand, this guy beat this former world champion, then he beat a guy who went on to become a world champion in the future, and so on and so forth. But I think a good way to opine about the credit we ought to be giving someone for a win is by comparing it to other similar circumstances. I know this can lead to one going around in circles, but it's still a decent way to put things into perspective, and the comparative side of things will really come into play in the conclusion of this video. Now in the instance of Whyte's win over Allen, look, when talking up Anthony Joshua's resume, most people would mention AJ's win over Dillian Whyte himself as one of his good wins. Definitely AJ's best pre-world title fight win, and I know this might be a bit of revisionist history here, but AJ's win over Dillian Whyte is arguably a bigger win than any of his first 3 world title fight victories. But now here's the thing, Dillian Whyte defeating Dave Allen isn't awfully dissimilar to AJ beating Whyte. AJ was the A-side against a hungry undefeated Whyte who was there to win in what was a crossroads fight. And Whyte was the A-side against an Allen who was also undefeated and had hopes to go on and have a good career. It's not exactly the same of course, as Whyte had much more experience when he lost to AJ than Allen did when he lost to Whyte, and AJ's win over Whyte definitely aged better than Whyte's win over Allen in terms of what the loser of each fight went on to do in their career after the fact. But if you want to gist on the way things were looking at the time going into those respective fights, well, Anthony Joshua was a way bigger betting favourite over Dillian Whyte than Dillian Whyte was over Dave Allen. I know betting odds aren't everything, and with the size of star power that AJ has, the odds in his favour might not always be conducive to reality, but the fact that AJ was a 1-16 favourite against Whyte, and Whyte was just a 1-6 favourite against Allen, at least proves that these two fights aren't awfully dissimilar. Of course, the nature of those two fights are completely different too, because AJ vs Whyte was a big British title fight grudge match pay-per-view main event with all of this backstory behind it and a big build-up, and it ended up being a banger in the ring that ended with a climactic knockout, whereas Whyte vs Allen was a fairly random short-notice fight on a Josh Warrington undercard, and the British Boxing Board of Control couldn't even put the British heavyweight title on the line due to Dave Allen's inexperience, and the fight ended up going the distance and wasn't too exciting. But Whyte took a guy's O with a decisive win, just like AJ did him, so yeah. I was really just going to brush past the Dave Allen win by saying that Dillian Whyte beat a Dave Allen who literally had done nothing in his career yet. But when I did this comparing, I was actually like, I will speak about the Allen fight as a noteworthy win for the resume. Now to move on to the next fight in Dillian Whyte's career, on this run after the loss to AJ in that British title fight. He would have a crack at the British title again when he faced off against Ian Lewison for the vacant British heavyweight title in October of 2016. The belt had been vacated by AJ when he won the world title back in April of that year. Now I was also kind of considering brushing past this Ian Lewison fight because who's Ian Lewison? But I just held credence to Whyte's win over Allen, who wasn't even liable to contest for the British title, and Ian Lewison was liable to contest for that belt, so let's talk about it. Ian Lewison was a former Southern Area heavyweight champion, which probably made him liable to fight for the British title, and his record was 12-2 with 1 draw going into the Dillian Whyte fight, which ain't a flattering record, I must say. But he was on a 5-fight winning streak at the time, and was coming off of a win in China that actually got him world ranked, so Ian Lewison was no journeyman. The static at the press conference would suggest that Lewison was coming for the win in this all bricks and affair and all. Ian Lewison did look dangerous early in the fight. Big 20-stone guy bombing forward, and he is quite athletic for his size. But Whyte was just sort of rope-a-dope and was in control by the end of the second round. Whyte would continue to outbox Lewison throughout the rounds. It was somewhat competitive, but Whyte was vastly out-throwing and outlanding Lewison, boxing Lewison around and getting stuck in to throw combos that were discouraging Lewison. There were definitely body shots in there that Lewison didn't like. And in round 10, the damage finally started to show as Dillian Whyte bloodied Lewison's nose. Looked like he broke his nose actually, and he began to make easy work of Lewison as the round went on. And when round 10 finished, Lewison's corner pulled him out of the fight. So Dillian Whyte was the winner by stoppage, and he was the new heavyweight champion of Great Britain. Now the Lewison win is one of the lower level wins that's worth mentioning in regards to resumes. Is it really better than the Dave Allen win just because Allen wasn't liable to fight for the British title because he didn't fight a British title eliminator? Well look, Ian Lewison had done way more in his career at the point of fighting Dillian Whyte, and Allen went on to do more after fighting Whyte, as up and down in his career went on to be. Lewison and Allen both had different incentives to want to get the win. For Lewison, it was the British title on the line, and for Allen, it was keeping the O. So you know what, I'll just say those two wins are around the same level as okay wins for the resume on the grand scheme of things. They were both dominant wins as well, in which Whyte won pretty much every round of both fights, so he proved himself to be a class above these sort of English level guys, as he should have. I would say he won every round against Lewison apart from maybe the first round, but Whyte kinda just used that round to figure Lewison out. But yeah, very decisive win either way. Just 2 months after winning the vacant British title against Ian Lewison, in December, Dillian Whyte would be back in there against none other than Del Boy, Dereck Chisora, in a WBC title eliminator. So Whyte was making up for lost time for that half a year out of the ring after the AJ loss and the surgery by having 4 fights in the back half of 2016. This fight was the co-main event of Anthony Joshua vs Eric Molina for the IBF heavyweight title. The fight famously had an epic build-up, with probably the best ever gloves are off episode and an exciting press conference with a bunch of other entertaining moments posted on the interview outlets. This was peak 2010s British heavyweight boxing. But more importantly in regards to resume, let's quickly look at what version of Dereck Chisora Dillian Whyte was up against. Chisora is now known as a guy with a double-digit amount of losses, but at this point, he had 6 L's on his record. Of course, he has more than twice that many losses now. Chisora was coming off of a comeback win against a journeyman after his decision loss to Kubrat Pulev in Bulgaria. And before the Pulev loss, he was on a pretty mediocre 5-fight winning streak, which came after his loss to Tyson Fury in their rematch in 2014. So Chisora was hardly on a great run at this moment in time, but he was a former world title challenger, challenging for Vitali Klitschko's WBC title in 2012 and going the distance. And this was Dillian Whyte's first time fighting someone with world level experience behind him and a half decent resume of his own. First former world title challenger Whyte was up against. So Chisora had the experience advantage over Whyte, and he was also a dangerous guy with a great gas tank, and he was to show up motivated for this fight because it was a grudge match. And despite Whyte being the A-side here, he wasn't that big a betting favourite. So this was a live opponent in Dereck Chisora, and Chisora's 6 losses at the time had come against the best of them. Also, one more thing quick, Dillian Whyte's British title was not on the line for Dereck Chisora to win here due to Chisora's fight week behaviour. Baby ting. So this fight was a 12-round banger in the ring. It stole the show and lived up to the hype. Dillian Whyte actually ended up winning a split decision on the cards, so a win is a win. But if Chisora got robbed here, then we ought to put an asterisk over this win on the resume. Oh, there was the win over Chisora in 2016, but Whyte was lucky to get the decision there. Now, having rewatched the fight for the 12th odd time for this video, I did just score the fight again. If my memory serves me correctly, I think I might have had it a draw the last time I rewatched it. I don't know how long ago that was, a couple years ago maybe, but that's just off memory, and I'm not asked to try and find the card because some of my old scores are on pen and paper and some are on old broken phones never to be seen again. But anyway, more importantly, was Chisora robbed here? Should there be an asterisk over this win? So, scoring it just now, some of you might not like this, but I scored the fight to Dillian Whyte, 116 to 112.
116, 112, 3 times. I'm not going to... You've seen me moan before about scores. It is what it is, but... Because it's a waste of time. It's not a 116, 112 fight. He was in the fight. He's coming into the fight as the champion. It's like you get no respect on the scorecards. 116, 112 twice. And you get one judge that wants to score it 116, 112 to Artur Beterbiev. You give Dmitry Bivol 4 rounds in that fight.
When they've gone 116, 112, I'm sitting there going, 116, 112, 116, 112, 116, 112. Unanimous. Unanimous.
Now, there were a bunch of close rounds here, but I just think Whyte did the way more consistent work all round. Here is how I scored each round. First round to Dillian Whyte, second round to Dereck Chisora, third round to Dereck Chisora, fourth round to Dillian Whyte, fifth round to Chisora, sixth round to Whyte, seventh round to Chisora, and round 8 to round 12, all to Dillian Whyte. I know giving Dillian Whyte round 8 might seem crazy because Chisora rocked Whyte in that round, but for the whole first nearly 2.5 minutes of that round, Whyte was just teeing off on Chisora, and then when Chisora had his moment late in the round, Whyte was still throwing back and landed a couple himself. And in round 10, yes, Chisora landed the bigger shots in that round, but he far from dominated the round. He spent most of the round gasping for air and not throwing anything, and Whyte was touching Chisora with a higher volume of shots, and he landed good jabs there. But if you do give Chisora rounds 8 and rounds 10, and ultimately give the fight a draw, then that is fair, I suppose. Yeah, a draw is fair in this fight. But me giving it 116, 112 Whyte wasn't me being as complimentary to Whyte as possible in terms of the swing rounds because I'm trying to big up his resume in this video. There were close rounds that I gave to Chisora as well. Round 2, round 7 even. But yeah, I think Whyte did the way better work all round, and definitely looked stronger in the championship rounds and all. The official judge who had Chisora winning gave it 6 rounds to 5 to Chisora with an even round in there. That's a 115 to 114 card to Chisora. I don't do even rounds personally, but hey. And unfortunately, how the official judges scored each round isn't available for us to see. But the BoxRec fan scoring had it 115 to 114 to Chisora too, with round 7 as the even round, a round that I actually gave to Chisora. Personally, I take that BoxRec average fan scoring with a pinch of salt. And now the other 2 official judges had it 115 to 113 to Whyte and 115 to 114 to Whyte. 115 to 113 to Whyte seems like the logical card here, but I still think my 116 to 112 card ain't all that crazy. The 116-112 phenomenon has been a thing on this channel in the past, so if you know, you know. So was Dillian Whyte lucky to get the decision here? Absolutely not. It was a close fight, but one that he won fairly. Yes, it was a split decision, which is a very official way to say that he only edged the fight, but to me, this is just a straight up win on Dillian Whyte's resume. A draw would be fair, but a Chisora win is a little bit of a reach, I'd say, hence why the one judge who gave it to Chisora had an even round in there. But yeah, either way, proper win for Dillian Whyte. He got away with outboxing Dave Allen and Ian Lewison fairly comfortably, but now he had an experienced opponent who was a beast in there and just charging at him all night, and Whyte still managed to box well in there and get the win. So Dillian Whyte took his first loss to Anthony Joshua in late 2015 when he kinda had no resume at all. He was then out of action for 6 months, but by the end of 2016 he had already built up a decent resume. The Allen win and the Lewison wins were good domestic level wins. Then there was the Chisora win, which brought Dillian Whyte to proper world title contender status. Okay, so Dillian Whyte would not be able to carry his late 2016 momentum into 2017. He vacated his British title in January because he was ordered to defend his belt against Sam Sexton, but he opted not to fight Sexton as he felt this was a step back on his road to a world title, which is true. So Whyte was then meant to be having a more world title contender type fight in June against Mariusz Wach, but Whyte had to pull out of the Mariusz Wach fight due to a foot injury. So Whyte would not be back in the ring until August of 2017, fighting Malcom Tann in an 8-rounder deep on the undercard of the undisputed super lightweight title fight between Terence Crawford and Julius Indongo. Dillian Whyte stopped Tann in round 3 behind 4 knockdowns, which is what you ought to be doing against such opposition. The fight would have been stopped in round 2 in most cases, but this was just one of the most based refereeing performances I've ever seen, so the fight was made to last longer. Tann kept trying to get up at 10 so the ref would wave it off, but Tann made it look like he got up, but the ref just weren't having it and he was actually letting it continue. So Tann just had to flop to the ground in reaction to the last Dillian Whyte body shot, so the ref was forced to stop it. Go watch the fight after this video, it is pretty jokes. Now this was just a stay busy fight for Dillian Whyte, scheduled 8-rounder against Malcom Tann. Tann was 24-5 at the time, which ain't the worst looking record, and 3 of the losses were to decent names, but he also hadn't beaten anybody and had lost to a couple of nobodies. And most importantly, Tann had a 9-year hiatus from the ring from 2007 until 2016 and was 1-1 since coming back. So this stay busy fight does nothing for Dillian Whyte's resume. Ain't any better than the Ivica Bakarin win, nor the Brian Minto win. Well, this win isn't as good as those wins. So this win is just a part of the winning streak, I guess is the most I can say about it. So Whyte was back in the ring in October of 2017, fighting Robert Helenius on the undercard of a now unified world champion in Anthony Joshua. Joshua, who was defending his unified WBA and IBF titles against Carlos Takam. When Whyte was announced to be on this undercard, there were complications in regards to who he'd fight, and talk fell through with a couple guys, but it was Robert Helenius who eventually took the fight with Whyte on only 2 weeks' notice. Now this was nowhere near as interesting a fight as the Dereck Chisora fight in terms of fan reception. Remember that Chisora fight was a big grudge match with a mad build-up and all that, and Dereck Chisora had been in there with bigger names at the point of fighting Dillian Whyte than Robert Helenius had. But we're not given credit for losses when talking about guys' resumes. So as forgettable as the Helenius fight was, Robert Helenius is arguably the most accomplished Dillian Whyte opponent at that point in regards to his resume. Of course his resume surpassing that of Dereck Chisora's. Robert Helenius had just 1 career loss. He had 3 wins over former world champions, that being Lamont Brewster, Sergey Gleichovic and Samuel Peter, and he was a former 2-time heavyweight champion of Europe. Now Dereck Chisora was just a 1-time European champ, he had no wins over former world champions, and most of all, Helenius actually beat Chisora in a vacant European title fight. It was a split decision that people do reckon Chisora ought to have got the nod in. It was in Helenius' home nation of Finland, and Chisora did actually get the shot at Vitaly Klitschko off of that loss. I'll be real though, I'm saying nothing because I've never actually scored that fight personally, and I'm already watching every Dillian Whyte fight in full as research for this video, so maybe I'll score Helenius Chisora another day for a Chisora video or something. But either way, Helenius got the nod there, and with his wins over ex-world champions and that, he was the more accomplished on paper than Chisora at the point of fighting Dillian Whyte. So I will go out on a whim and say that Helenius was the most accomplished fighter that Dillian Whyte had fought to that point. I told you guys I was going to be yapping, didn't I? Much like Chisora though, Helenius wasn't on the best run at the point of fighting Dillian Whyte. He was a year and a half removed from his only career loss, which was a knockout loss to Johan Duhaupas, and his 3 wins since that loss weren't so notable. And all that wins over ex-world champ stuff and European title stuff happened several years before this fight with Whyte. Helenius was inactive for the whole of 2014 and hadn't got a big win since his return in 2015. So let me not act like he was some legend on a great run, but he was a good fighter nonetheless, and people have gotten world title shots off of fighting such guys, or even guys on a much lower level, but let me save all that for later. Oh, and quickly, this Whyte vs Helenius fight was for the vacant WBC silver title. So this was a forgettable fight in the ring and all, and most people who remember this fight do remember it to be boring. Dillian Whyte won 119 to 109 on 2 cards, and 118 to 110 on the other, a unanimous decision. Helenius had a fairly decent first couple of rounds, catching Whyte on the way in a bit, and Whyte just looked lackadaisical in those opening 2 rounds. But from round 3 to round 12, it was all Dillian Whyte. Helenius would just not engage. His output was so low and he was just retreating. But Whyte did what he had to do in there to win a wide decision. He beat Helenius up to the body when he got to him, and did push the action enough to do some damage for sure. Had Helenius' nose bloodied in the later rounds. Now there's the thing of Helenius taking this fight on just 2 weeks notice and looking rather disinterested in the fight, but it was still a dominant win by Whyte. Definitely more decisive than his wins over Chisora. And I just gave the argument that Helenius was a more accomplished opponent than Chisora, so I might have to call this Helenius fight Whyte's biggest win to that point of his career. On paper. And he won the vacant WBC silver title in that fight and all. Fights being exciting makes us hold them to a higher level of credence. Naturally, of course, we have much fonder memories of Chisora Whyte than we do Whyte Helenius. But if anyone was to say that we can't big up Whyte for winning a highly competitive slugfest against a guy that he ought to be beaten decisively in Chisora, well, here's the decisive wide decision win against a top name in Helenius. And one thing to consider in regard to Helenius' strategy in there, or lack thereof, well, you have to be in there with someone dangerous enough to make you box like that. Maybe Helenius gave up engaging after a bit because he didn't see himself keeping up a decent output against the guy who was beating him up to the body so much. So yeah, boring and forgettable fight, but definitely a good win for Whyte's resume. That's a solid world title contention win. Oh, and the win didn't age particularly well per se, but it definitely didn't age badly, as Helenius continued to box on at a high level for the next 6 years after that fight, proving that the Robert Helenius who Dillian Whyte beat certainly wasn't washed up. It weren't all losses against the big boys for Helenius either. Helenius took Adam Kownacki's O in 2020, then smashed him up in the rematch and all. So with wins over Dereck Chisora and Robert Helenius, Dillian Whyte already had a way better resume than other world title challengers of his era. Again, we'll look at that more at the end. So next up, Dillian Whyte was taking on Lucas Big Daddy Browne in a main event at the O2 in March of 2018. So this was the beginning of Dillian Whyte's 2018 here. This was somewhat of a grudge match here, not on the level of the Chisora fight of course, but the two men had traded words online in the past after Lucas Browne had pretty much said that Dillian Whyte wasn't worth fighting. So yeah, some static did build up there. In regards to how valid a win over Lucas Browne would be for the resume, it gets a bit murky for certain reasons. So Lucas Browne was 25-0 going into the Dillian Whyte fight. He had won all 25 of his professional boxing bouts, and he was a former world champion, if we include the WBA regular belt. But even then, he was stripped of that belt for failing a drugs test, and the version of Lucas Browne that was fighting Dillian Whyte was a supposedly off-the-roids Lucas Browne. Lucas Browne won the Regi belt off of the acclaimed Ruslan Chagayev in March of 2016. This was a big win for Lucas Browne. He came in as the underdog in this fight in Chechnya. He actually got knocked down and hurt badly by Chagayev in round 6 and only just survived that round, and Browne was well behind on the cards going into round 10. But round 10 was the round that Browne would drop Chagayev out of nowhere. Chagayev really struggled to make the count, but the ref let him go on. But of course, Browne would just rush at Chagayev with a barrage of thudding blows and then stop Chagayev on the feet. This was an upset come from behind victory on away territory that was so upsetting that Chagayev's wife had to tell the cameraman to get out of her face. So this was a big win for Browne. But now, it was a couple months after the Chagayev loss that Browne would pop for clenbuterol and get stripped of the WBA regular belt, and it was originally reported at the time that Browne's win would be overruled to a no contest. So yep, convicted drug cheat here. Ruslan Chagayev was reinstated as WBA regular champion, but he retired shortly after due to eye problems, so the belt was vacant again. Despite the previous drug test failure, Browne was set to fight for the vacant WBA regular title again against Shannon Briggs. But that fight was cancelled as Lucas Browne popped for Ostarine this time. That was just 8 months after popping for clenbuterol. So after the Briggs fight fell through due to Browne's second drug test failure, Browne's next fight was against a journeyman in June of 2017, and this win he got over the journeyman was Browne's only fight between the Chagayev fight in March of 2016 and the Dillian Whyte fight in March of 2018. So I did say I wasn't going to harp on about steroids too much for Dillian Whyte, so I'll keep the same energy for Lucas Browne, as obvious as it may seem that he was on roids. Because none of Lucas Browne's wins were actually officially overturned to no contest. The Chagayev win actually still stands on his record somehow, and although Lucas Browne was stripped of the WBA title for literally failing a drug test, his title reign is not retroactively wiped from the history books, the way that Francois Botha's IBF title win was erased in the 90s for failing a drugs test. So to look at Lucas Browne's pedigree, yes, he is a former WBA regular heavyweight champ. Won the belt off of the reigning champion Ruslan Chagayev, who was on a good winning streak and was actually the former main WBA champ at heavyweight when he took Nikolai Valuev's O and won his belt back in the day. So big win there for Browne over Chagayev. And Browne got himself in that WBA mix when he won the international belts against the undefeated Andrei Rodenko 3 fights before the Chagayev fight. And other than that, Lucas Browne had a win over James Toney. Now, Lucas Browne was not the most technically refined boxer by any means. He came into the game so late. Dillian Whyte's last 2 opponents in Robert Helenius and Dereck Chisora were most certainly better boxers than Lucas Browne technically. Ian Lewison and Dave Allen were as well, to be honest. But Lucas Browne had a lot of punching power, and he did win a wide unanimous decision over James Toney over the 12-round distance. An old James Toney, but still James Toney. So Lucas Browne wasn't a useless boxer at least. Now, something here that proves that Dillian Whyte was being matched up well by Eddie Hearn outside of the world title politics is that we again have a situation where Dillian Whyte is fighting his toughest opponent to that point on paper. Lucas Browne was technically a former world champion, he was undefeated, he had a win over a legend, and he had an aura of danger. But Whyte's previous 2 opponents were kind of just better than Lucas Browne. That's not to say that Browne was some bum that had no business being in there with Whyte. The facts are that he was an undefeated former WBA regular champion who was there to win. Browne was actually less of an underdog against Whyte than Helenius was, but that could be because Robert Helenius came in on such short notice against Whyte though. Dillian Whyte's WBC silver heavyweight title was on the line here. In the ring, Lucas Browne was just looking like Lucas Browne in there, plodding forward, throwing bombs here and there, and having the chin to take a good shot from Dillian Whyte. But Whyte was just dealing with Browne way better than Browne's previous 25 opponents who had lost to him could. He was active with the jab, threw good combinations of all shots, and he was punishing Browne to the body in typical body snatcher fashion. A cut opened up over Browne's left eye and was bleeding badly by the end of round 2. Whyte couldn't miss on Browne at times in there, and in round 5 he really painted Browne's face red with that jab. By the end of that brutal beating that Whyte dished out in the 5th, Browne had swelling around both eyes and of course had the worsening cut over the left eye. Browne came out to see if he could land a big one early in the 6th, but he ran into a lethal Dillian Whyte left hook that put him flat on his face with his arms by his side. Dillian Whyte absolutely brained him there. Browne looked dead, to be honest. So a round 6 knockout win for Dillian Whyte over Lucas Browne. As I said before, Browne is not the most technically refined boxer at all, but Whyte did what he had to do against such an opponent and really murked him in there, bloodied up his face and sparked him out. If you heard how Cole Froch and Adam Smith on commentary were acting surprised about Browne's lack of defense in there, and you hadn't seen a Lucas Browne fight before yourself, you would have thought that this was a bad Lucas Browne performance. But no, this is just how he boxed. I reckon the Sky Sports commentary team may have not done much research themselves because they were going crazy about how bad the cut was, but they failed to mention Browne's history of getting cut. So Dillian Whyte won in dominant fashion over a former WBA regular champion. Yes, the guy ain't the greatest boxer. Whyte was coming up against a guy who wasn't as good a boxer as guys who he'd already fought, but Browne was an accomplished and dangerous fighter. With the whole stuff about Lucas Browne being stripped of the WBA title and his lack of boxing ability, and the sort of inevitability of him being exposed and losing his O at a certain level, I don't know if I should say that this win is better than the Helenius win nor the Chisora win. As I've said, both of those guys were better boxers than Lucas Browne, and Dillian Whyte outpointed a Chisora who was very game on the night and was coming to do damage, and he won a wide unanimous decision against Helenius. But in regards to fashion of victory, Dillian Whyte beat Lucas Browne in the best way you can beat a guy, gave him a beating and knocked him out cold. So even if the wins over Chisora and Helenius are more impressive when we read into it, Whyte literally destroyed a Lucas Browne who didn't know how to lose at the time. He took his O. So either way, this is a good win for the resume. Not an all-time great win at all, but definitely a win you could get a world title shot off of, much like the Helenius and the Chisora wins before this. So at the point of the Lucas Browne win, Dillian Whyte already had a world-level resume. By the way, this Lucas Browne win didn't age very well. You know, he went on to get stopped by Dave Allen in the year after and lost a bunch of other times. But you also can't say that the win aged badly for Dillian Whyte because he was fighting a 38-year-old Lucas Browne, and after the beating that Dillian Whyte gave him, what else was Browne really going to do after that? It actually doesn't make sense in any circumstance to say that a fight you won by a dominant beatdown aged badly because you can attribute the damage done by the fighter in question as the reason for the opponent's downfall in later fights. Wins like this can only age well or just not age at all kind of thing. Alright, now for the big one. Dillian Whyte already had a good resume beyond worthy of getting a world title shot with, but next up, he was up against Joseph Parker in July of 2018, headlining at the O2 again. Joseph Parker was Dillian Whyte's first actual former world champion opponent. Now this fight was such a high jeopardy fight for both guys. Joseph Parker had just lost his WBO World Heavyweight title to Anthony Joshua in an attempt to become a unified heavyweight champion of the world just 4 months before this Dillian Whyte fight, and Parker could not afford to lose 2 times in a row. And Dillian Whyte was the WBC #1 contender and could not afford to lose his #1 spot after all the wins that he had accumulated since his loss to AJ back in 2015. And although Joseph Parker lost a clear decision to AJ, he did not take a beating in that fight at all. So Whyte was fighting a guy coming off of a loss here, but it most certainly wasn't a thing where Dillian was getting AJ's leftovers. No. The guy lost his world title to AJ in a dull 12-rounder which was plagued with poor refereeing in the second half of that fight, and Parker wanted to find his way back to a world title ASAP. So as I've said before, it's way too easy to shit on someone's resume by spinning certain things. Oh, he fought him when he was coming off of a loss. But in this circumstance, the fact that Dillian Whyte is fighting a Joseph Parker coming off of a loss makes that version of Joseph Parker more dangerous. Parker needed a win. 2 losses in a row would have just kind of wrote him off from the world title picture for a bit. Maybe for 7+ years, eh? So yeah. Oh, Oh shit, man. So yeah, Joseph Parker did not take much damage in that 3-belt unification fight with the then WBA and IBF champ Anthony Joshua. The first 5 rounds were boring thanks to both guys, but then in round 6, when the action heated up a bit, when Parker started to push the action a bit more, that's when the referee just started breaking the action for no good reason really, and this remained a theme until the end of the fight. There were actual clinches that the ref broke up at times, but the ref was definitely breaking the action unnecessary, which was marring the potential entertainment value of the fight, and spoiling the chance for Joseph Parker to get to work in the close, because obviously AJ was getting the better of things at range. Some fans go a bit far with it and act like Joseph Parker would have just definitely won the fight if the ref gave him the chance to work in close, but he would have had a way better chance for sure, and he arguably had his only chance to win taken away from him. But either way, Parker lost a wide unanimous decision in that world title unification, and he wasn't happy with his performance. He wanted to get back to winning ways against Dillian Whyte. Now, Joseph Parker was a top fighter. Before his first career loss to AJ, he was the reigning and defending WBO champion. Alright, I'll get the cat out of the bag now just to justify the forthcoming yap. I'm about to give a little resume analysis on Joseph Parker himself now, because I believe this Joseph Parker fight to be Dillian Whyte's biggest win, so I do want to give focus to it. That being Parker's resume at the time of fighting Dillian Whyte. Now, I want to call this a prime Joseph Parker that Dillian Whyte fought. Some might say Parker is in his prime now in 2025, but either way, he obviously wasn't past it then, as he was only 26 at the time, and he's still one of the best heavyweights around now. And he clearly wasn't an unestablished novice or anything at the point of fighting Dillian Whyte, because he was a former reigning and defending world champion at the time. So Joseph Parker won the vacant WBO world heavyweight title by a majority decision against Andy Ruiz in a really exciting fight between 2 young undefeated heavyweights, and he then went on to make 2 successful title defenses before losing in that unification fight to Joshua. Some people did have Ruiz beating Parker in that vacant title fight. I did recently watch it back and score it for the first time in years. I did edge it to Ruiz. I had it in 115, 113, but there were a bunch of swing rounds in there. Like, that is a fight that could really go either way. 7-5 Parker on 2 cards is totally valid. Not going to analyse that whole fight here, but look, Ruiz wasn't robbed there. And that was a very game and undefeated Andy Ruiz who Parker got by there as well, so valid world title win. People would call this one a robbery just because it was in Parker's home nation of New Zealand and it was close, and those decisions of that hometown decision in favour of Parker in that world title fight weren't helped by what was not the best world title reign for Parker after winning that vacant title fight. Parker's career all round is great, but his 2 actual world title defences were nothing to write home about. Joseph Parker's WBO mandatory was David Haye at first, but Haye was occupied with the Tony Bellew grudge match, so the WBO just made their Intercontinental champion Hughie Fury the mandatory for Parker's belt. So Parker's first title defence was meant to be against a young Hughie Fury in New Zealand, Parker's hometown, because Team Parker won the purse bid. But that fight was first postponed due to travel complications on the part of Team Fury. But after the fight date was postponed, Hughie Fury just fully pulled out due to an injury anyway. A back injury, I think they said it was. So Joseph Parker was left to fight his sparring partner Razvan Kajanu on short notice, who was ranked number 14 in the WBO, just about liable to fight for the belt. So yeah, Joseph Parker's first world title defence was against the unaccomplished Razvan Kajanu on just 2 weeks' notice, and Parker ended up winning a fairly wide unanimous decision in what was a really awkward and unenjoyable fight. This wasn't Parker's fault though. Hughie Fury and his team were playing games and messed them about a bit, and Team Parker had to find a short notice opponent. Unfortunately, this was an underwhelming start to a title reign. But Parker's second title defence would actually end up being against the undefeated Hughie Fury, who would reschedule with him. But this time around, the fight was scheduled to take place in Manchester. Joseph Parker beat Hughie Fury by a majority decision in that fight in Manchester, which was a joke of a fight. Many would attribute that fight's lack of eventfulness to Hughie Fury's run-in and clinching, but at the same time, some would say that there is a case for Hughie Fury winning that fight against Parker, but let's not go there for the sake of everyone's mental well-being. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves! And after that Hughie Fury fight, Parker would lose that unification fight to Anthony Joshua. So I did have to put that out there. I can't act like Joseph Parker had some legendary title reign. His lackluster reign wasn't really his fault, but it is what it is there. But as I said, beating Andy Ruiz in a vacant title fight was a very big win, and before that vacant world title shot, Parker did have somewhat of a resume already. Parker got the vacant title shot off of a round 3 knockout win over Alexander Dimitrenko, and a couple fights before that, he beat Carlos Takam. And this was before Takam lost to AJ, so yeah, Parker beat Takam before AJ did. Joseph Parker had a big 2016, man. 5 wins in the year, including the wins over Takam and Dimitrenko, and it was capped off with that vacant world title fight victory over Ruiz. Too bad Parker's 2017 consisted of a couple of underwhelming title defences, but either way, they were successful world title defences. He got by those guys who would have been coming to win with the world title belt being on the line. And Parker did also beat Francois Botha back in 2013 in just his 6th pro fight, but I'll be real, that was a really washed up Francois Botha. But anyway, all round, Joseph Parker had a really solid resume going into the Dillian Whyte fight. He was literally a former world champion, he had built up a decent resume before winning the world title, and his world title loss to AJ wasn't awfully damning, and he was undefeated before that AJ fight. But most of all, Joseph Parker was a very good boxer. He was fast and athletic for a heavyweight, he moved well, and he had a great chin, and had never, ever been dropped before. Yes, Joseph Parker had never been dropped before at the point of fighting Dillian Whyte. After fighting Anthony Joshua, Andy Ruiz, and other solid fighters, that chin hadn't been cracked yet. In this Parker vs Whyte fight, Joseph Parker was the betting favourite. This was Dillian Whyte's only time coming in as an underdog at the time, other than when he was a massive underdog against AJ and obviously lost. So Dillian Whyte had never won a boxing match as a betting underdog at this point in his career. Dillian Whyte was the A-side here, this fight being in the UK and all that, but the fact that Whyte was the underdog as the A-side proved how much this accomplished just-turned former world champion with great boxing ability in Joseph Parker was tipped to beat him. The odds were close, but yeah, it's the A-side, B-side stuff that would have tightened those odds up and stopped Whyte from being such a big underdog. So the fight had a nice fast start for a heavyweight affair. In round 2 now, unfortunately Dillian Whyte became the first man to officially drop Joseph Parker by bogus means, as the replay would show that Whyte pretty much knocked Parker down with a headbutt. The 10-8 round was scored. For the following rounds, Whyte and Parker would have a nice back and forth affair. Dillian Whyte was as scatty as ever in this fight, but the rough and tumble unorthodoxy was discouraging Joseph Parker in there. Parker did start to drop off in the second half of the fight. And in round 9 now, Dillian Whyte dropped Joseph Parker properly this time with that big famous left hook. Whyte did get to Parker's chin there. That was a proper knockdown. So Whyte did become the first guy to properly knock down Joseph Parker after that questionable one back in round 2. Being as tough as he is, Joseph Parker recovered fairly well from the knockdown, and in the championship rounds he did come back into the fight a bit, especially in the 12th and final round. Parker buzzed Whyte in the 12th and went for the kill. He then kind of gassed out a bit, so Whyte turned it around and started to have a bit of a moment himself. Both men sort of looked out of it and they kind of went back and forth, and at the end of the round, Parker dropped Dillian Whyte hard. Whyte's legs really went there. But Whyte made the count, and that was his first time getting up from a knockdown in his pro career, and he held on for the remaining few seconds of the round. The fight went to the cards, and Dillian Whyte won a unanimous decision, winning 115 to 110 on one card, 114 to 111 on one card, and 113 to 112 on the other. Now of course, Dillian Whyte should not have had a 10-8 round in that second round, but the ref counted it so the judges have to score it. So with that being said, I reckon that the 115 to 110 card to Whyte is actually about right. If in theory all 3 judges gave the second round as a 10-9 to Whyte, then Whyte would have just won a majority decision. And if in theory all 3 judges gave that round a 10-9 to Parker as opposed to a 10-8 to Whyte, then the fight would have actually been scored a draw. But either way, I personally agree with the 115 to 110 card, and I think that Whyte done enough to win without the falsely called knockdown in the second round anyway. So Dillian Whyte won a clear unanimous decision over a top fighter who was desperate for a win and was a world champion as recently as 4 months before that point. Whyte became the first man to drop him, and Whyte survived the onslaught in that exciting final round. Fun fight in which the 2 heavyweights traded knockdowns, and Dillian Whyte came out on top in this crossroads must-win affair. So the resume was already there for Dillian Whyte at this point as far as I see it, with wins over Joseph Parker, Lucas Browne, Robert Helenius, and Dereck Chisora. He already probably had the best ever resume that a heavyweight ever put together before challenging for a world title at this point. Like ever. The issue was that Whyte wasn't undefeated, and the guy who he'd lost to back in the day now held 3 of the world title belts, and he was the cash cow for Matchroom Boxing, and Whyte was almost Matchroom's secondary heavyweight, and the other belt was held by Deontay Wilder. Wilder's world title was recognised by the WBC, who have no regard for meritocracy at times, and this whole ordeal with Whyte not getting a shot at him was of course one of those times. So it really isn't hard to discern why Dillian Whyte didn't get a world title shot with all the circumstances at play, but that resume, boy, you ain't seeing no one with a resume like that who's never fought for a world title. Apart from maybe one guy, but that's for later. If you don't agree, then you'll just have to wait for the comparative stuff that I'm going to do later, and then you will agree. So here's Dillian Whyte's record since losing to AJ here on screen at the point of the Parker win. I can end the video here and say that Whyte's resume is valid. You know, we can all go home now. That resume is not overrated at all. Anyone who gets sick of hearing about all the guys that Dillian Whyte beat before getting a world title shot and rebuke those talks by saying that Whyte's resume is overrated are just wrong. But there's a lot more to cover. Now, in regards to the manner of victory, yes, it was a decisive win over Joseph Parker in my opinion, but to me, the reason that the manner of this victory uplifts how good the win is for Dillian Whyte's resume even more is the fact that Whyte became the first man to drop Parker, even though Parker had fought Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz in the past. And Parker wouldn't be dropped for another 3 years after the Whyte fight. Not that this makes a difference to the resume, but as well as retaining the WBC silver title against Parker, Whyte also won the vacant WBO international title in that fight, so at that point, he was objectively the number one heavyweight in the world outside of the two champions Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder. Well, I guess the lineal champion Tyson Fury as well. In regards to how Whyte's win over Parker aged, well, it definitely didn't age badly, but again, wins can't really age badly unless you struggle with a guy who goes on to get smoked shortly after. But the question of whether this win is one that aged amazingly is up for debate. There's no doubt that it was a good win for the time for all the reasons that I've already mentioned, but can we retroactively add credence to this win for Dillian Whyte based on what Joseph Parker went on to do in the following years? So as for what Joseph Parker did before fighting Dillian Whyte, that already makes the Parker win a great win on Whyte's resume. Not good, great. Maybe not all-time great, but great for sure. If we want to add credit onto this 7-year-old win for Dillian Whyte based on what Joseph Parker has done in recent times, then in theory, this Parker win would be an all-time great win that Whyte has on his resume. But we can't really just do it like that, as good as it may sound when trying to big up Whyte. So if you were to vouch for this win aging amazingly, you would say Dillian Whyte beat a guy who beat Deontay Wilder, Zhilei Zhang, and Martin McCauley. Which is literally true now, but all of those wins came over 5 years after Dillian Whyte beat Joseph Parker. So there is a great argument that the version of Joseph Parker who beat those 3 guys is a different version of Joseph Parker than the one that lost to Dillian Whyte. Parker did go on a win streak after losing to Dillian Whyte. He went on a pretty mediocre 4-fight winning streak, then fought Dereck Chisora twice and won 2 competitive decisions over him. The first one being a split decision, and Chisora already had 10 losses going into that first Joseph Parker fight. But either way, Chisora is a good win, and Parker did beat him twice to extend his winning streak to 6. Joseph Parker then got absolutely battered and stopped in round 11 by Joe Joyce. That was Parker's first loss since the Whyte fight, and his first stoppage loss there too. Parker claims that he felt ill before that Joe Joyce fight and that he was done for by the end of the first round. I wouldn't usually let an excuse mar a whole fight for me looking back, as I wouldn't want to take away from Joe Joyce's performance, but with how well Parker did in his fights after that fight, and how badly Joe Joyce did in his fights after that fight, I do now believe that Parker was not right going into that fight, I can't lie. So Parker got 3 mediocre wins to bounce back from that Joe Joyce loss, but those 3 wins were then followed up by the 3 big wins over Wilder, Zhang and McCauley. So he suffered 2 losses in a row to AJ then to Whyte, went on a 6-fight winning streak, lost to Joe Joyce, and he's now on a 6-fight winning streak again. Now if we are to call the Joseph Parker of his last 3 fights a reinvigorated, new and improved version of Parker, then you logically can't really say that Dillian Whyte's win over him aged well based on Parker's very recent success, because it's a different version of Parker now. But if you believe that it's the same version of Joseph Parker now, but things are just clicking well for him matchmaking wise and he's having a good run, then you can actually say that Whyte's win over Parker aged so well that we can now call the Parker win an all-time great win for Whyte. That's up to you guys though, I'm not deciding that. But just to note, if you do want to say that the Parker that beat Wilder was the new and improved Parker training under Andy Lee, well, Parker was with Andy Lee since that first Chisora fight, in fact, if that makes any difference. One thing about Joseph Parker being sick for that Joe Joyce fight though, if we do attribute Parker losing in that fashion to Joyce to Parker being ill, that fact along with the whole refereeing situation in Parker's fight with AJ means that the Dillian Whyte fight is the Joseph Parker loss. That's the main loss out of his 3 losses. That is the unquestionable one. So yeah, the Parker win just makes Dillian Whyte's resume great. Okay, so Dillian Whyte would be main eventing in the O2 for the 3rd time in the year 2018 on December 22nd, and he was having his 2nd pay-per-view main event in a row. It wasn't just the Dillian Whyte versus Joseph Parker main event that made that pay-per-view event in July so great. It was also Dillian Whyte's former rival Dereck Chisora pulling off an upset come-from-behind knockout win over Carlos Takam in a thrilling co-main event that made the night great all round too. And on November 1st of 2018, it was officially announced that Dillian Whyte would rematch Dereck Chisora on that December 22nd date. Now on one hand, it was great that we were going to get to see the score settled from their split decision 2 years prior, the fight that many fans believed that Chisora deserved a nod in. And it was a thrilling battle the first time around that came off the back of a great build-up, and now the British public were treated to this rivalry being reignited. But on the other hand, it was a thing where, surely Dillian Whyte deserved a shot at the world title by now. Why has he got to fight Chisora again? Since Whyte beat Chisora the first time, he picked up 3 world level wins. So an immediate rematch with Chisora back in the first half of 2017 would have been cool, but now Whyte was, well, rankings wise, in line for a world title shot. Why risk getting in there with Chisora again? Big pay-per-view payday and all that, but again, in regards to waiting for a world title shot, this was all risk and no reward for Dillian Whyte, as Chisora was bringing up to sort of getting Whyte's head in both the gloves are off and the final press conference. I ain't gonna lie, Chisora did win the final press conference before the rematch with these words.
Like Dereck says to him and goes to him, why do you take this? You're there. You're number 1 with the WBC. You're top 5 of everybody. Why risk it against me?
I know why.
Why?
Because you're not fighting his corner for him to fight for the WBC. That's why you're selling him short.
Really? What?
Yeah.
What, against you?
Man, the guy was a WBC champion for like silver for about 1.5 years, and you haven't fought his corner rightly, so it says a lot, man.
Well, maybe he thinks this is the right fight. Maybe he thinks this is an easy touch for the money.
Come on, man. You know, fight for your boy, man. Come on, boy. Right now, you're not fighting his corner. Let's be honest.
I'm fighting his corner. I just think this
You're
is
not fighting his corner, man. You're not fighting his corner.
Oof, Maron. Anyway, we're here to talk about who Dillian Whyte fought, not who he didn't fight. So for the purposes of resume analysis, let's look at what Dereck Chisora did between his first and second fight against Dillian Whyte. I didn't talk about how the first Chisora win aged after looking at that fight, because obviously Whyte and Chisora would go on to have this rematch 2 years later anyway. So Chisora was out of action for 9 months after the split decision loss to Whyte. He was meant to rematch Robert Helenius in spring of 2017, but that one fell through, so he'd be back fighting in September against a 4-2 journeyman, and he TKO'd him in the 5th. Nothing to write home about there. Not much more than a month after that, Dereck Chisora would be off to Monte Carlo challenging the undefeated German Agit Caballero for his European title. In the fight, Agit Caballero would outbox a relatively unmotivated looking Chisora for the most part of the fight. Chisora would start to have some success and get through with some shots later in the fight, but it was too little too late. Caballero kept his title with a majority decision win on the cards, just edging it on 2 cards, and obviously the other card was a draw. But one might argue that the official cards were rather generous to Chisora. And at the time, this was Agit Caballero who hadn't really done anything in his career yet. Hardly had to beat any killers to become a European champ. And despite him being the undefeated defending champion, Chisora was actually the favourite going into this fight. And as for the old stuff about how results age, losing to Caballero may not seem so bad in hindsight given that Caballero is now arguably the number 2 heavyweight in the world. It's between him and Joseph Parker right now, behind Usyk. But much like the thing of having to look forward all the way to this present day to have Whyte win over Parker aging as an all-time great win, you also have to fast forward all the way to this present day to consider Dereck Chisora losing the competitive decision to Caballero as a loss that aged well. Caballero didn't do anything for years after beating Chisora. Well, as far as a little casual fan in the UK like me is concerned at least. Throughout the years, we're talking 2018 up until 2023, whenever I took a look at the heavyweight rankings on Box Live, I'd see Caballero up there with his pretty undefeated record and go, oh yeah, the guy that beat Chisora. Let me check his record and see if he'd done anything else since. And yeah, I'd see that he'd pick up good European level wins in Germany on a rather inactive basis that kept him up the world ranks. I can't say that I was keeping an eye on German boxing and actually watching his fights at the time at all. And I know boxing ain't just about what happens in the States and in the UK, but let's be honest, the UK ran heavyweight boxing back then. And the US had their little say too of Wilder being WBC champ. And literally nobody ever spoke about Caballero in the UK nor the US. Unless we were talking about him in the vein of that guy that Chisora lost to in Monte Carlo when he had a bad night. Much like Joseph Parker's current run started with that big upset victory over Deontay Wilder on the Day of Reckoning card in late 2023, Caballero's current run started with his upset win over Arslanbek Makhmudov on the very same card. Caballero was not rated before that, hence why he was such a big underdog going in against Makhmudov, which does seem insane in hindsight, I know. So yes, Chisora did suffer a bad loss between the first and second Dillian Whyte fights. At the time, this loss was definitely worse than his European title loss to Robert Helenius from back in the day. So it's not a thing where Chisora lost a majority decision to a guy who went on to do great things shortly after. Nah. The even scorecard was a gift to Chisora, and nobody outside of Germany gave a shit about Caballero for years after this. After that 2017 win over Chisora, Caballero didn't pick up another proper world level win until 2024. So Caballero was actually the lowest quality of opponent that Dereck Chisora had ever lost to at that point in time. We could say that it aged to become more excusable than other losses on Chisora's record, but we're talking at the time. The loss definitely didn't age well by this Dillian Whyte rematch, I'll tell you that much. So Chisora was back in March of 2018 against a random in another scheduled 8-round comeback fight on the undercard of Dillian Whyte vs Lucas Browne. He got the guy out of there in the second round, as you do. And then of course in July, on the Whyte vs Parker undercard, Chisora would score that massive knockout win over a game Carlos Takam to put a close to what was a really fun brawl. This was big at the time. Chisora was a slight underdog coming into that fight, and Takam was coming off of a stoppage loss to AJ in challenging for AJ's unified titles. That was kind of an early stoppage that Takam lost to AJ, and Takam would have won it back to winning ways after that. He'd only lost to the Elite in the past decade at that point, and he'd never lost twice in a row at that point. And Chisora knocked Takam out to serve Takam his first 2-fight skid. So let's say in theory that Dillian Whyte getting a world title shot was physically impossible for some reason, and that did seem to be the case. The stars were almost aligned for this rematch between the two rivals. Whyte just won a banger against Parker, and Chisora won in a banger against Takam on that very same card. So it was time for them to meet again later in the year to finally settle the score. Now I said all of that stuff about Chisora's loss to Caballero not aging well just to assert that other than the Takam win, Chisora didn't have the best 2 years between the Dillian Whyte fights. If I wanted to fully glaze Dillian Whyte's resume by proxy in every way, shape and form, then I could have just brushed off Chisora's loss to Caballero between the two Whyte fights by bigging up Caballero. But nah, I'm telling the truth on every nuance here. Although Whyte's resume was already great at this point and he didn't need to improve it before, fighting for a world title and all that, could have just waited for the shot, does beating Chisora again boost the resume up that much? Well, Chisora's loss to Caballero definitely makes it debatable. Chisora did go on to attribute his lackluster performance in that EBU title fight to the lack of atmosphere amongst the Ponzi Monte Carlo crowd, the casino in Monaco that Eddie Hearn randomly gets the knack to stage events at from time to time, if you didn't know. And Chisora is more of a guy who shows up for the roaring drunkards at the O2 Arena. Chisora was motivated for Takam in the O2 and would be motivated for the Dillian Whyte rematch in the O2 as well. And now ahead of this rematch, this was a repackaged Dereck Chisora. Dereck War Chisora rather than Del Boy. He was now under the management of former foe David Haye. I can't certifiably say that all of that makes beating Chisora for a second time any more impressive than the first. Not like Usyk beating Dubois in a rematch, let's say. Usyk didn't just beat Dubois then beat him again, he beat Dubois and then beat a version of Dubois that had gone on an absolute run and defeated Jarrell Miller, Filip Hrgovic and Anthony Joshua leading up to that rematch. But Dillian Whyte beat Dereck Chisora, then he's fighting a Dereck Chisora who lost to an unproven Caballero and beat Takam. Nothing against Whyte for taking the rematch, of course, given the aforementioned circumstances, but I'm just pontificating on what a second win over Chisora actually does for the resume. One thing is for certain that this was an all-risk and no-reward fight for Dillian Whyte, risking his number one position to possibly lose to a guy who gave him hell last time out and lost to a random German kid since. Whyte could have lost this rematch based on how the first fight went, and Whyte would have been seen as done for if he did lose based on Chisora's lack of direction at the time. So in the ring, the two men picked up where they left off from the first fight. Chisora was bombing forward with big shots, and Dillian Whyte was getting stuck in with aggressive counterpunches. Both men were trading big shots to the head and body. Me personally, I actually had Chisora 4-2 up after 6 rounds. Now, I gave round 7 to Dillian Whyte, and in round 8, Marcus McDonald deducted a point from Chisora for low blows. These were borderline shots, and in a fight of this nature, you've just got to allow them ones a bit. Whyte landed borderline shots in there as well. Chisora got done dirty here, and I gave Whyte the 8th round, which would have been a 10-8 for him, so I had Chisora 2 up after 6, and actually ended up having Whyte ahead on the cards after the 8th round due to the deduction. Whyte continued to outlander pursuing Chisora for the next couple rounds from what I saw, and in round 11 now, Chisora was deducted another point for a straight up individual incident. Whyte was leaning on Chisora, so Chisora threw up a cheeky light elbow to his face as if to say, "Get off me," and that was the point gone. I know throwing an intentional elbow is a bit of a mad one, but it was pretty soft and Dillian Whyte was moving scatty all night himself, with the forearm and with the shoulder. It was just a scrappy affair anyway, so just leave him to it. Don't pick and choose when and who to penalise. But hey, Marcus McDonald is still on this bullshit to this day. Now in this 11th round, Dillian Whyte would literally just knock Dereck Chisora the fuck out. Clean. Like Chisora looked dead there. Looked more gone than Lucas Browne was. Chisora hadn't been dropped like that since David Haye put him down 6.5 years before this. But Chisora actually got up from that one against Haye. But Whyte literally brained Chisora here. So yeah, nobody had ever separated Chisora from his senses like that with all the big names he'd fought. Or I guess you could say no one's rendered him unconscious like that. Big knockout to cap off an exciting fight, and cap off what was a great 2018 for Dillian Whyte and British heavyweight boxing. A Christmas present to the fans this rematch was. Now just to note, Dereck Chisora was ahead on 2 of the 3 official judges' scorecards after 10 rounds had finished. He would have been 6-4 up on both of those cards he was ahead on, with the point deduction off from the 8th round. Is the fact that Whyte was behind on 2 of the scorecards at the point of the knockout an issue? Well, I'd say no, because those scorecards were debatable anyway, but Whyte went on to actually sleep Dereck Chisora, which is the most decisive way to win. But some people would actually put an asterisk over this victory by saying that Chisora was rushing for the knockout after the unfair point deductions, so he knew he was behind on the cards and he was overcompensating, and he then left himself open to get knocked out. The point deductions were a baby thing for sure, but at the end of the day, if you get knocked out, then you get knocked out. I can't take away from Whyte putting Chisora down like that just because of some soft referee, and that isn't Whyte's fault. So a second win over Chisora. Look, the only reason I won't gas it up so much is because the resume was already great before this, but the fashion in which he beat Chisora the second time around does make it impressive. The first fight between the two went the distance, and one judge had even given the fight to Chisora, but this time around, although Whyte was a bigger betting favourite than he was the first time, he was actually more tipped to win on points than he was by KO in this fight. So I guess you could say he upset the method odds and became the first man to stop Chisora in 4 years, and the first man to put him down in 6.5 years. Now, minus the Malcom Tann fight, Dillian Whyte's quality of win kept going up and up, but it kinda ends here, I'll be honest. The Parker win before this was way bigger than his win over Chisora in the rematch, all things considered, especially with Chisora losing in between his 2 fights with Whyte. But yeah, getting the knockout and settling the score like that, it's definitely another good win for the resume. Aside from the resume quickly, well, it's kinda related, but yeah, Dillian Whyte had an amazing 2018. 3 0-2 headlines and he got 3 massive wins. Smoked Lucas Browne and took his O, beat Joseph Parker and became the first guy to drop him, and then knocked Dereck Chisora clean out. And he dropped all of those guys with left hooks as well. Wow, man. Dillian Whyte just dropping guys with left hooks in the O2, having the crowd absolutely roaring. That's peak British heavyweight boxing, man. Peak Sky Sports boxing. You could argue that Dillian Whyte had the best 2018 out of any heavyweight, including AJ, Wilder and Fury. So Dillian Whyte had the resume at this point. He was beating his opponents in exciting fashion. He had a great deal of star power due to those exciting fights and his trash talk at press conferences and banter in interviews, and he had the top rankings with 2 of the major governing bodies off of pure meritocracy. He was almost like a world champion without actually being a world champion, but more on that later. So at the end of 2018, I could just stop here and say that's it. Dillian Whyte had a great resume. End of story. But there is of course a lot more to the story. I'm not gonna lie, 2018 was peak Dillian Whyte, so it doesn't get much better from here. He doesn't get a world title shot anytime soon after 2018 ends, and doing anything significantly better than what he did in 2018 without getting a world title shot would have actually been criminal. So I'm not gonna lie, I am just gonna kind of try and rush through the rest of it. I mean, we are getting on long now, aren't we? So of course, after defending the WBC Silver and WBO International titles against Chisora in the rematch in December, Whyte would neither be fighting the WBC champ Deontay Wilder nor the unified champ Anthony Joshua, who held the WBO belt that he was in position for. We wouldn't see Whyte in the ring again until July of 2019. That's over a year and a half out of the ring. And he was fighting the undefeated Oscar Rivas with the vacant WBC interim heavyweight title on the line in a pay-per-view main event at the O2 Arena again. The interim title is the highest form of contender belt that puts you most in line for a full world title. But the mix of it being with the WBC and in the heavyweight division probably makes it as meaningless as it can be. Anyway, let's not get into detail because that's kind of irrelevant to the resume talks. Either way, this was an interim title fight against an undefeated guy. Rivas was 26-0 and coming off of a stoppage win over former unified world heavyweight title challenger Bryant Jennings. Other than that win, Oscar Rivas hadn't really beaten anyone else in the pros. But yeah, he was coming off of a solid win, he didn't know how to lose, and he was very dangerous. He also had a good amateur record with wins over Kubrat Pulev and Andy Ruiz. If you're not sold on Rivas as an opponent, then go watch Barry Hearn sell this fight at the launch presser. I'm serious, go watch it. So Oscar Rivas did come out looking dangerous in this fight. Seek and destroy type approach. Dillian Whyte stopped Rivas in his tracks with a big right hand in the second round. Not sure if Rivas was as hurt as people made him out to be, but it was a good shot from Whyte nonetheless. As the rounds went on, Dillian Whyte was outboxing Rivas for the most part, keeping Rivas guessing and keeping him away with a good jab and straight right hand. The pressure fighter Rivas found it hard to get in close and get to work. At the halfway point of the fight, between the 6th and 7th round, Rivas' corner urged him to push the action more. Rivas would attempt to do so, but this led to more openings for Dillian as he would whip in uppercuts and punishing body shots from Rivas in the 7th and 8th rounds. So this was good action here. Early in round 9 now, Rivas' danger factor came to fruition as he came at Dillian Whyte with a combo and put him down with a clean right uppercut. Ooh, it was the uppercut that AJ knocked him out with too. Could Dillian recover with 2.5 minutes of the round to go? Yes, Whyte would manage to keep away Rivas for the remainder of the round and even had a strong end to the round against a then tired looking Rivas. Rivas kept coming forward in rounds 10, 11 and 12, but Whyte would be outlanding Rivas for the most of the final 3 rounds, and the fight ultimately went the distance. It went to the cards and Whyte won a unanimous decision. 115, 112 on 2 cards, and 116 to 111 on the other. That's 2 8-4 cards and a 9-3 card in his favour with the knockdown he conceded. So Dillian Whyte outpointed a dangerous and undefeated heavyweight and climbed off the canvas to do so in order to become the WBC interim heavyweight champion. Rivas was number 5 in the WBC, which was more than high enough to contest for the vacant interim belt, so he was no joke. Not to beat a dead horse, but Whyte should have really had a full world title shot at this point, and the fact that he had to climb off the canvas for a win here proved the great risk factor of fighting these dangerous guys while being the long-time number 1 contender. He showed the vulnerability to the uppercut here again. Wouldn't it be diabolical if Whyte went on to get knocked out clean with an uppercut in one of these high-risk fights before getting a title shot, eh? But anyway, the Rivas win was a very good win for the resume. Not great like the Joseph Parker win, but this was definitely up there with the Chisora wins and the Browne win, the Helenius win. It's a world level win, and Whyte won in convincing fashion as well. This Rivas win was arguably better than those 4 aforementioned wins on paper. In terms of how this win aged, well, Rivas never lost a pro fight again after fighting Dillian Whyte, but he only had 2 more fights. He did become the inaugural WBC Bridgerweight World Champion in his final pro bout, if that means anything to you guys. Okay, so next up, Dillian Whyte would be fighting Mariusz Wach on the undercard of Anthony Joshua vs Andy Ruiz 2 in Saudi Arabia in December. This was the same Mariusz Wach that Whyte was meant to fight in June of 2017. Now this December 2019 fight was Whyte's first time not main eventing in over 2 years. After the Rivas fight, it was revealed that there was an adverse finding from a drug test that Dillian Whyte took, and he was initially stripped of the WBC interim title. Whyte's fight with Wach on the AJ undercard was only announced like a week and a half before that card took place, so this was a short notice thing for both Whyte and Wach probably. And after the drug test investigation or whatever, Whyte was cleared to fight just a day before the Wach fight, and he was reinstated as WBC interim champion. But that belt was not on the line for this Wach fight. This was just a 10-rounder. In terms of what a Mariusz Wach did for the resume, well, he had a record of 33-5, and he had been in there with top names. He was a former Klitschko challenger. He went the distance with Vladimir Klitschko on that one. Wach had been TKO'd at the top level, but he'd never actually been dropped. He was several years removed from any noteworthy wins, and he was a week away from turning 40 years old on fight night. Now this win wouldn't do much for the resume, but this was just a short notice, stay busy fight for Dillian Whyte to get on a big card. Dillian Whyte was fat and looked depressed going into this fight. Only 12 pounds heavier than he was for the Rivas fight, but he looked ostensibly in way worse shape in this fight, and this was his career heaviest by 11 pounds. I remember there being interviews at the time about Whyte not training for this fight and all that. Beating Mariusz Wach was hardly going to make Whyte's resume worse though, and you could say that Whyte was risking the number 1 spot again, but nobody really expected Wach to beat Whyte at all. Whyte was as much a betting favourite against Wach than he was going into his last fight to date against Ebenezer Tete. So Dillian Whyte won this fight by unanimous decision. 2 97-93 cards and a 98-93 card. Clear win there. This fight was a weird one, sluggish one. 2 fat heavyweights plodding around in there. It wasn't a boring one though in my opinion. Action picked up as it went on and there were decent trades. Dillian Whyte landed nice body shots throughout the fight, which I reckon was the difference here. He didn't have a moment where he really hurt Wach at any point. Wach actually kind of buzzed him at the end of the 8th round, and the 2 fatties slugged out in the last 2 rounds. Whyte was fighting off the ropes at times and they were just whacking each other with shots. Whyte landed the better shots though, and yeah, it was a clear unanimous decision win for Whyte. Again, I can't say that beating Mariusz Wach does a lot for the resume, but it doesn't bring it down at all. I could spin it and try and big up the Wach win, but I don't need to do it at this point because of how good the resume is already. This was just a stay busy fight. He was very fat in there. I'm not going to give Whyte credit for winning while out of shape because it would have been a short notice fight for Mariusz Wach too, but we'll excuse Dillian Whyte for going the distance with Wach and the fight being somewhat competitive due to how out of shape he was. But most importantly, a win is a win, and winning streaks are a very good look for the resume. And this Mariusz Wach win put Dillian Whyte on an 11-fight winning streak since his loss to AJ in 2015. Alright, so next up, Dillian Whyte was meant to be making his first defence of his WBC interim heavyweight title against Aleksander Povetkin in May of 2020, but there was the COVID pandemic, whatever happened there, so the fight got pushed back to August and was happening in front of no crowd. By the time the fight happened, it was 8.5 months out of the ring for Dillian Whyte. Povetkin is actually older than Mariusz Wach. He would have been 40 at the time of this fight and a week and a half off of turning 41. So in regards to what a win over Povetkin would do for the resume, people would say, Dillian Whyte fought a 40-year-old Povetkin. But not all heavyweights are washed up at 40 years old. Povetkin was the inaugural WBA regular world heavyweight champion, and he was 30 years old, a week shy of turning 31 when he won that belt, so it's not as if he was in his prime in his early to mid-20s or anything like that. Povetkin has a really good resume himself, and he did not have any long stint of inactivity during his career. He had been fighting at a top level consistently since his championship days, and still was at the point of fighting Dillian Whyte. Povetkin won that WBA Reggie belt against Ruslan Shagayev in 2011. But Povetkin already had a decent record before winning the title, having beaten a 30-0 Eddie Chambers and a Chris Bird who was only a year removed from being IBF heavyweight champion of the world. As for that WBA regular title reign that started in 2011, Povetkin made 4 successful title defences, including wins over Marco Huck and Hasim Rahman, until he challenged for Vladimir Klitschko's unified titles in 2013 and fell short. After the Klitschko loss, Povetkin went on an absolute run with wins over Manuel Char, a Carlos Takam who had yet to lose at top level, Mariusz Wach, Johan Duhaupas, and it was Povetkin's brutal KO win over David Price in 2018 on the undercard of the unification between AJ and Parker that lined Povetkin up for a shot at AJ's unified titles. Povetkin fell short to AJ in the unified title fight at Wembley, but in 2019 he bounced back with a win over Hughie Fury. And a few months after that one, on the same AJ Ruiz 2 undercard that Whyte fought Mariusz Wach on, Povetkin fought to a draw against the prime Michael Hunter. So Povetkin was active. He'd fought just as recently as Dillian Whyte had, and he was still fighting at the top level. Yeah, he was 40-year-old, but the difference in age factor between heavyweight boxers and lighter weight class boxers is like the difference in age factor between goalkeepers and outfield players in football. It's very different. So this was a dangerous Aleksander Povetkin, and this was to be a big fight for Dillian's resume, and Dillian was coming in shape for this one. So Povetkin did look game from the off. He didn't look washed up or anything at all. He was backing Whyte up with decent shots, but Whyte did manage to take control more in the second round. The action opened up a bit more from the part of both men, but Whyte still seemed in control and was getting the body shots in nicely. Early in the 4th round, when the two men were getting stuck in, Whyte dropped Povetkin with a left hook to the side of the head. And I can't lie, the way that Povetkin dropped from that shot to the side of the head is the way an old man gets knocked down. Povetkin made the count comfortably and looked on point as the round went on though. But at the end of the round, Whyte dropped Povetkin again with a nice counter left uppercut. Povetkin made the count and the round was over. So Whyte had just dropped Povetkin twice in the 4th round. Surely this old man was done. It was time for Whyte to do the business in the 5th round. But early in the 5th now... I remember watching this one with my cousin in his house at the time, and when Whyte went flat on his back and his head knocked that advertisement board away out of the ring, me and the cousin just looked at each other speechless. Dillian Whyte risked his position too much and waited all this time for a title shot, and he lost his interim title and his winning streak was over just like that. That's it, done. You had your chance, now off to the back of the queue. This was bound to happen, constantly getting in there with dangerous and more experienced guys. Dillian Whyte wasn't just going to go on a 20-fighter winning streak, was he, against that level of competition? The counter left uppercut from Povetkin was so rude though, and I've always liked Povetkin's style, so it was kinda cool to see him doing his thing at that age, but I was definitely more so burnt on behalf of Dillian Whyte here. At the time, that counter left uppercut under the right hand that had the man flat on his back was the craziest uppercut knockout I'd ever seen live to that point. That fact only remained for the next couple months, but it was still nuts at the time. Whyte would have been well ahead on the cards at the point they got knocked out, and it was just a flash knockout that he suffered. It's heavyweight boxing at the end of the day. But seen as this was a loss, it does not count for anything on Whyte's resume. Whyte got done by an uppercut again. He finally lost before getting a world title shot after having deserved a shot several fights ago, and Povetkin was the new WBC interim champion, in line for what was then Tyson Fury's WBC heavyweight title. Dillian Whyte wanted to get revenge and to get his interim title back after that flash KO loss in the fight that he was getting the better of. And luckily for Dillian Whyte, he was still working with Rematch Room, so we got the immediate rematch. The rematch was meant to happen just 3 months later in November, but it got postponed as Povetkin caught COVID. The fight was postponed a couple times and didn't end up happening until March 27th of 2021. It was to take place in front of a small crowd in Gibraltar. Of course, this was still during the pandemic. In regards to resume, a win for Whyte in the rematch will do what a win would have done for him the first time around, with all the experience Povetkin had, the big names that he had in his record, and the fact that he was still a bad man, based on what he had just did to Whyte himself in 2020, and on top of his activity back in 2019. Whyte was dominating up until he got chinned, so if he could win in convincing fashion in the rematch, it's hardly like the win and loss against Povetkin just cancel each other out. No, we credit Whyte with a win over Povetkin on his resume. But it is unfortunate that Whyte was stuck rematching a 41-year-old for the interim title and that he was no longer on a winning streak. And based on how the first fight ended, Whyte could very well lose to this old bloke a second time in a row and just be fully out of the title picture. This was very possible, hence why the odds got closer in the rematch. Now in the ring, Dillian Whyte came to get it back in blood. He rushed at Povetkin and had him on wobbly leg from the first minute. Whyte didn't go full buck wild though and Povetkin got his legs back under him, but Whyte stayed in control throughout this first round and in the second round too. Whyte would still be dominating in round 3, the round where he landed a peach of a counter right hand. Povetkin dipped to the head slot to land a big left uppercut or left hook to the body or even a pop-up left hook to the head, but Whyte dipped down to match his head slot and stopped Povetkin in his tracks with a big right hand to the face. I always remember that shot, man. Round 4, Dillian Whyte was just fully beating Povetkin up and marking up his face. He wobbled Povetkin later in the round and had him like a deer in the headlights, then cleaned his clock with a nasty left hook. That was it. Dillian Whyte got his revenge knockout and he was a 2-time WBC interim champion. That's how you win a rematch now. Remember, not too long before this, Anthony Joshua got beat up by Andy Ruiz in the first fight and lost his titles to him. And then AJ got flack for just boxing Ruiz around in the rematch and outpointing him and arguably running away, some people might say. And Dillian Whyte now, he got flash KO'd by a dangerous Povetkin and really just mashed him up in the rematch and managed to stop him earlier than Povetkin stopped him in the first fight. He got his proper revenge, did Dillian Whyte. Now on paper, this Povetkin rematch could be considered Dillian Whyte's second best ever win, behind the Joseph Parker win. Povetkin had a better resume than Joseph Parker did at the point of fighting Dillian Whyte. Povetkin had the best resume out of anyone that Dillian Whyte had fought by a good bit. But of course, Joseph Parker was just coming off of being a world champion and all the other good stuff that we discussed earlier. So the Parker win is definitely the best win on Dillian Whyte's record. So yes, Povetkin was 41 and he looked old and all that, but all of the best Eastern European heavyweights fight on into their 40s. You could say that the win didn't age so well as Aleksander Povetkin retired straight after the loss, but you could also say that the duology with Whyte prompted the retirement. Povetkin still boxed on after the AJ loss. He went 12 rounds with Fury, then went 12 rounds with Michael Hunter, but it was the Whyte duology that did him. I want to call the Povetkin win great, to be up there with the Parker win, which is great, but there is the case that Povetkin was at the end of the road anyway when he fought Whyte, and he was past his best. You could say that Povetkin pulled off a miracle in the first fight after already taking damage in that fight, then he had to go through a whole nother training camp for the rematch, and then by the time he got into the ring for the rematch, that was it for his old legs. So whether or not you deem this a great win just depends on how much you reckon Povetkin's age played a factor. The win doesn't feel great as it was a rematch. The still pending world title shot for Dillian Whyte was years overdue. His chin got exposed again in that first fight with Povetkin and we got reminded about how vulnerable he is. It didn't seem like Whyte could go on to win the world title now anyway, even though he deserves the shot. And it was like, yeah, at this point in 2021, avenging a loss to a 41-year-old Povetkin didn't feel amazing. It didn't feel like one of his biggest wins. But let's say we compare this Povetkin win to his knockout win over Chisora in their rematch. When Whyte knocked Chisora out, he was at the peak of his star power. He topped off a great year headlining the O2 Arena for a third time, and throughout that whole year, everyone wanted to see Whyte either get a shot at Wilder for the WBC title or get the AJ rematch for the unified titles. Two things that there were still hopes for at that point, especially the AJ rematch for the unified titles at that particular moment in time. And Whyte's rivalry with Chisora was of course a great domestic feud. So as a Dillian Whyte fan, yes, the Chisora win would feel better at the time, but objectively, picking apart the resume retrospectively, the Povetkin win is probably better. Chisora kinda lost to everyone as well. The guy basically trades brain cells for cash, which is kinda base to be honest. So yeah, Povetkin win is a world title defense worthy win. So this win adds to the argument that Whyte had a world championship level resume. So you know what? I'll call the Povetkin win great, and I will call it the second best win on Whyte's resume, over Chisora 1 and 2, over Browne, and over Rivas. I know that's up for debate, so feel free to differ in the comments. Alright, so Dillian Whyte was meant to make another WBC interim title defense against one Otto Wallin in October of 2021. At that point, Otto Wallin's only loss was the competitive decision loss to Tyson Fury in which he busted Fury open, and he got 2 wins since that loss, including a win over Brazeale. So another potential banana skin before Whyte fought for the title here. Now, Whyte would actually pull out of the Wallin fight just 10 days out due to a shoulder injury, and he just said fuck it and chose to not reschedule the Wallin fight and just wait to fight Tyson Fury for the WBC title. Fury, who had just beat Deontay Wilder in their trilogy fight. In December, the WBC ordered Fury to fight Dillian Whyte. Finally, the WBC champion got ordered to fight him. I guess Wilder was just exempt from having to fight Whyte somehow. The Whyte vs Fury fight didn't actually get agreed upon until late in January 2022 though, as this is when Tyson Fury was first looking to fight Aleksander Usyk for the undisputed title, and there was loads of other stuff with the negotiations.
He said that you were being tough on the negotiations.
So Dillian Whyte would finally get his WBC world title shot on April 23rd of 2022 in Wembley Stadium against Tyson the Gypsy King Fury. Now this fight came off of a year of inactivity for Whyte, since that Povetkin rematch in March of 2022. Whyte was not fighting Deontay Wilder, the champion he was chasing for all those years. He did not maintain his winning streak, and his chin got checked before he even got his title shot. And yeah, this just wasn't the peak of Dillian Whyte's star power, with everyone begging for him to get a title shot like in 2018 or 2019. It's almost like he passed his prime before getting a title shot. Insane. So yes, this was a deserved and long overdue world title shot for Whyte, and it did not matter who he was fighting, as long as he got the shot. And this was a massive domestic fight in England, and a big title defence with Fury coming off of the Wilder trilogy. But this fight was just a weird one, man. It wasn't the same as it would have been with Whyte coming off of the winning streak. His momentum seemed gone. He was coming off of the longest stint of inactivity in his career by far since his 2-year ban. Between the Helenius fight and the Chisora rematch, that was active Dillian Whyte. But this shit was just meh. Build-up was underwhelming and all. Knowing Whyte's trash talk history, I thought he might have been the one to finally take the piss out of Tyson Fury's drug addictions and all that, but I guess not. This is of course a resume video, so let me quickly say now. Dillian Whyte's resume was already outstanding for a guy who had never fought for a world title yet. If you want to talk about Whyte's resume, we could actually have stopped at the Povetkin 2 fight and disregarded anything from there. I know I've said that at a couple points in this video, but this time I'm being serious. The main body of his career ended here at the Fury fight. The fight was a weird one. Whyte boxed the whole first round in southpaw like he did in the Dave Allen fight 6 years prior. Didn't do anything with it here though. He was trying to box with Fury in there, but Fury was obviously getting the better of it. This was a scatty fight as well. Whyte was a bit dirty in there. Whyte went for a bit more in the 5th round, but Fury only got the better of things even more as a result of that. And in round 6, Fury did Whyte with an uppercut. That's it. Dillian Whyte fell short in decisive fashion after all those years campaigning for a world title shot, and all 3 of his losses came by way of knockout and by way of uppercut. And the pro-Fury faithful in Wembley were going mental with joy, while Dillian Whyte enthusiasts were left with bitter taste in their mouths. Also, Whyte was then 1-2 in his last 3 after that loss, both of the losses coming by knockout. So if he couldn't get a world title shot off of an 11-fight winning streak, he was hardly going to get a second world title shot, having lost 2 of his last 3 fights. So Dillian Whyte was out of the title picture after losing to Fury. Dillian Whyte would be back fighting 7 months after the loss in the world title fight. He was headlining Wembley Arena against the undefeated American Jermaine Franklin. So I did watch this fight at the time, and I'll be real. I have been rewatching all of these Dillian Whyte fights in full as research for this video, but the full fight between Whyte and Franklin is nowhere to be found. Not on YouTube, not on Dailymotion, not on any dodgy sites, and it must have been deleted off of the DAZN archives at some point for some reason. Bring back DVDs, man. Now, this is probably the worst fight that this could have happened for, because people say that Franklin was robbed in this fight. But I can't go back and score it now, because obviously the full fight ain't available, and I have no idea what I scored at the time. So I really and truly can't give my take on whether or not this win deserves to have an asterisk over it on the resume of Dillian Whyte. Now, what they also say about this fight is that it was a lackluster performance from Whyte. Now, upon rewatching the highlights, yes, this wasn't the best performance from Whyte. A bit sluggish and a bit too competitive against a guy he ought to be beating, just like the Mariusz Wach fight. Except this time against Franklin, there was actually a case for the opponent winning. Now, I did watch that little DAZN every punch video for this fight, and based off of that, Franklin didn't get robbed here actually. From what I see, there's not enough to put an asterisk over this victory for Whyte. Franklin outlanded Whyte overall, but Whyte just outlanded Franklin in the power punch department and arguably landed the bigger power shots. Big body shots and good shots upstairs that Franklin did have a good chin to take, to be honest. And actually, just to add, Jermaine Franklin only outlanded Dillian Whyte in the power punch department in 3 of the 12 rounds. And that is according to the CompuBox stats. Not going to gas up the win for Whyte too much because the fight was definitely very close. It was a majority decision that he got in the end, by the way. And going into the fight, Franklin had nothing but a few mediocre at best wins that he went the distance in. But Franklin was undefeated and he did look very game on the night, so this was a decent win for sure. The guy didn't know how to lose. If you're an OG on this channel, then you know I gave a great deal of credit to one Oliver McCall in an old video of mine for taking O's. Took the O's of Bruce Seldon, Lennox Lewis and Oleg Maskayev. That's 3 O's there. But Jermaine Franklin was the 4th O that Dillian Whyte took. Whyte took the O's of Dave Allen, Lucas Browne, Oscar Rivas and now Jermaine Franklin. Collecting O's like that is a flex for the resume for sure. Pause. Now, I'm not too fussed to find the specific interview at this delirious point in the video, but I definitely remember Dillian Whyte's old rival Anthony Joshua critiquing Dillian for going the distance with an opponent of Jermaine Franklin's caliber. But guess who Anthony Joshua would end up fighting next? Yes, Jermaine Franklin on April 1st of 2023, at the O2, and this was off of Joshua's 2 consecutive losses to Aleksander Usyk. He was no longer champion coming out of that duology, couldn't get the belts back like he did against Rivas. So Joshua ought to have been making easy work of Jermaine Franklin here to get the bragging rights over Dillian Whyte and set up the long anticipated rematch between the two rivals. Now Anthony Joshua would also be taking the distance by Jermaine Franklin in a stinker. AJ won more convincingly than Whyte did against Franklin, but AJ's fight with Franklin was way less entertaining than Whyte's and he failed to deliver on the expectation to stop Franklin, the expectation that he set in his own criticism of Whyte's failure to stop the yank. Anyway, AJ's win over Franklin set up the long-awaited rematch between Anthony Joshua and Dillian Whyte at the O2, same location of their first fight. And this was on August 12th of 2023, over 7.5 years after the two men's first fight in December 2015. Now this 2023 rematch between an Anthony Joshua coming off of his comeback win over Jermaine Franklin after back-to-back losses to Usyk, and a Dillian Whyte coming off of a bit of inactivity and a comeback win over Franklin himself after a KO loss to Fury, was not as big as a rematch between the two would have been in, I'll go as far back as 2017. And this 2023 rematch definitely wasn't as big as a rematch between the two would have been in 2018 or 2019, or 2020, or even 2021. But hey, classic rivalry here, and a rematch between these two at any stage would be enough to get the British boxing public hyped. Now me and my cousin got tickets to the O2 Arena for that fight, but unfortunately the fight got cancelled just a week out as Dillian Whyte failed a drugs test, so Whyte was replaced by Robert Helenius. Me and the cuzzy still did go to watch AJ vs Helenius anyway, but we obviously would have preferred to watch the Dillian Whyte rematch. Game's gone, boy. Should have just ended this resume video after Povetkin too, I swear. Whyte had popped dirty again, so surely he was a career-long drug cheat. It's time to virtual signal and pretend to be so outraged about failed PED tests. Now, unlike Conor Benn, who wore his heart on his sleeve and opened up about his mental health and all that and pleaded for sympathy from the fans when he failed a drug test, Dillian Whyte just disappears when he fails a drug test, goes MIA, runs off into the night as he might put it. Kinda based, innit? Failing a drug test then running off into the night until it all blows over. No, I'm just joking, I'm joking. But anyway, Dillian Whyte went AWOL for a bit, but upon the investigation, he no longer had a British Boxing Board of Control licence. But an investigation carried out by the Texas Commission found Whyte to be a victim of contamination, so he was cleared to box under a Texas Commission licence. Now Dillian Whyte would be back fighting on March 17th of 2024, St. Patrick's Day that is, fighting in a small hall in Ireland against Christian Hammer. Now Christian Hammer could be deemed a decent world level win on paper, based on the fact that he held wins over David Price and a Kevin Johnson who only had 3 losses at the time that Hammer fought him, so this was before Kevin Johnson lost to Anthony Joshua and then just lost to literally everyone else. And there are a couple of other half decent wins on Hammer's record. Hammer also had fought big names such as Tyson Fury, Aleksander Povetkin, Luis Ortiz, Joe Joyce and a good few others. But he lost to all of those top level guys, of course. And his biggest win was that David Price win, but that win was over 7 years old at the point Hammer was fighting Whyte. Hammer had 5 wins and 6 losses in his last 11 fights at the point of fighting Whyte, all of the wins being against nobodies, and he was inactive for over 1.5 years since his stoppage loss to Joe Joyce going into that Whyte fight. So when we look into all of that, a Christian Hammer win wouldn't do much for the resume. And when Whyte fought Hammer, Hammer looked in terrible shape in there. Whyte did what he had to do, but Hammer just quit after the 3rd round because he wasn't feeling it anymore. I remember Dillian Whyte being pissed off because he wanted to get more rounds in after that. But yeah, little comeback fighter after another failed drug test and 1.5 years out of the ring there. You could spin it to call Christian Hammer a decent level win on paper. I don't know this for sure, but I'm almost certain that Hammer was not world ranked at the time. He was looking like a bit of a pudding in there. So as for the talks of Dillian Whyte's world level resume, I'm not really going to hold this win over Christian Hammer to any regard. 7 months later, Whyte would be having another comeback fight. He would be fighting Ebenezer, the old geezer Tete, Fraser Clark's dad. This fight was in Gibraltar, Whyte's 2nd time fighting there. And this fight was on Sunday, December 15th, Whyte's 2nd time in a row fighting on a Sunday. Now, a win over Tete wasn't going to do anything for the resume, so there's no point in even really looking at this fight, but I will take a look at it. Tete was 23-1 and was just known for that one loss on the record, the round 1 knockout loss to Daniel Dubois in 2019, and other than that, Tete had just beaten a bunch of cans over in Ghana. He was listed as 37 years old, but many people believe him to be older than that in reality. I mean, 37, the man looks about 57. For what it's worth, this was a sloppy little slugfest that Dillian Whyte was getting the better of. He was winning every round, but Tete was right there in front of him and never really got properly hurt by Whyte. Never rocked. He definitely got discouraged by shots and softened up to the body. Tete displayed some weird body language at times in response to shots, but this guy who Dubois did in just a round, Whyte just did not look like he could knock him out at all. Whyte did get the stoppage, but this was when Tete's corner retired him after 7 rounds. So a decisive win, but going 7 with the guy wasn't the best look. People were grilling this fight and spoke about how terrible Dillian Whyte looked in there, and how that version of Whyte would get smoked by any decent heavyweight. But I would theorise that Whyte didn't really bother turn up in his best shape for this particular fight. And some boxing fans have a threshold for high-speed action with clean technique, and such fans would hate a ploddy heavyweight fight like this. But me personally, I like a smorgasbord of boxing, so I just rewatched this fight again with a cup of coffee and I quite enjoyed it. Anyway, in regards to resume, look, forget about him going 7 rounds with the guy. If he stopped him in round 1, it ain't doing anything for the resume anyway. If he lost to Tete or won a robbery over him, that would even tarnish the resume. But it was a decisive win. That does nothing. Going 7 rounds with the guy didn't age the best either, as Tete got stopped by his own son in the first round in his next fight after Dillian Whyte. So Ebenezer Tete was Dillian Whyte's last fight to date, so that's it for looking at his record now. Dillian Whyte was meant to main event the inaugural Queensberry on the Zone card in April against Joe Joyce, but Dillian had to pull out due to a thumb injury. Dillian was then allegedly meant to be on the Fabio Wardley vs Justice Junior undercard in June, but that one fell through. No opponent was ever confirmed in the first place, and many fans theorised that announcing Whyte on that card was just a scheme to sell tickets at Portman Road because the undercard for the Wardley-Hooney fight just weren't all that, and I'd say that theory is probably true. Now, as I speak, I'm hoping that I will be getting this video up at least a day and a bit before Dillian Whyte's Argos 16th fight against the young Moses Saitama. If I do, then that means I've either rushed the editing or gone out of my mind to get this video up. Well, both probably. But yeah, if Whyte pulls off the upset against Saitama, all things considered, that does wonders for Whyte's resume. I don't want to hear that Saitama was just a kid or whatever if Whyte does beat him.
He was a fucking kid.
Because Dillian Whyte is coming in as a massive underdog here and everyone expects Saitama to destroy him. If he beats Saitama, that's also the 5th O that Dillian Whyte would have taken, which I'd personally consider to be a great flex for the resume. But anyway, that fight's yet to happen as of right now, and Saitama is very expected to win, of course. If Whyte does lose to this kid in the fashion that people expect him to, then his career is probably over. He would have had a pretty bad last few years of his career. But he would still go down as the heavyweight who probably put together the best ever resume before fighting for a world title, if that means anything. So now it's time to give a little breakdown of the resume of Dillian the Body Snatcher Whyte overall. I did end up going off topic about other stuff that weren't really to do with the resume much and ended up almost doing a whole career retrospective. But the resume talks itself did make the video this lengthy though, as I had to almost do a mini analysis on the resume of each of Whyte's opponents to justify what a win over said opponent would do for Whyte's resume. I am actually going to sort his wins into certain categories by world level standards. So here are the 3 categories. We have great wins, good wins, and decent wins by world level standards. Because boxing fans who are fond of Dillian Whyte would tend to characterise his career by the fact that he got all of these wins without getting a world title shot, I will sort these great, good and decent wins into how much they warrant a world title shot. For the great wins, these are wins that you really ought to be getting a world title shot off of. Good wins are wins that you very well could get a world title shot off of, and you probably well deserve one after a couple of good wins. And decent wins are wins that you can get a world title shot off of. You wouldn't beg to see someone get a world title shot off of that decent win, but like you literally can get a shot rankings wise. Because people hype up Dillian Whyte's pre-world title fight resume so much, other people will naturally hold him to a high level of scrutiny. So anyone who thinks that his record ain't all that will literally laugh at the names I am about to show here. But when I compare him to other heavyweights of his time, you'll sit back and be like, oh. Boom. So for great wins, we've got, as you can see here, Joseph Parker and Aleksander Povetkin. I already discussed at length how great these wins were. when I looked at them before, especially the Joseph Parker win, which is just a legendary win for so many reasons. Good wins, we've got Dereck Chisora twice, Robert Helenius, Lucas Browne and Oscar Rivas, all very solid wins. And for decent wins, we have Brian Minto, Ian Lewison, Mariusz Wach, and Jermaine Franklin. Now I will give a bit of justification for the decent wins tier. So Brian Minto now. I did kind of dismiss that win earlier, but that fight between Dillian Whyte and Brian Minto was for a contender belt, the WBC International Silver title. So Minto probably would have been somewhere in the WBC rankings at the time. Even if it wasn't top 15, it couldn't have been too low at the fact that there was some belt on the line. And when it comes to all of that comparative stuff, guys in Dillian Whyte's era have gotten world title shots off of Brian Minto level wins. I'm definitely not saying that Dillian Whyte deserved a world title shot off of that, and he did go on to lose to AJ in his very next fight, which halted his momentum, because most guys who get a world title shot of those shit resumes are undefeated when they get the shot. But the fact is, Dillian Whyte won that fight. It's on his resume, and that is a win that you can get a world title shot off of. The Ivica Bakarin win and the Christian Hammer win are also arguably on the same level as the Brian Minto win, but the Bakarin fight was just a scheduled 8-rounder, and Christian Hammer was just completely done for and inactive when Dillian Whyte fought him. So I could add another 2 decent tier wins in there to bolster it up, but no, I'll just put the Brian Minto one in there. And as for Ian Lewison, I know earlier I juggled between which win was bigger out of the Ian Lewison win or the Dave Allen win, but simply put, Ian Lewison was world ranked at the point that Dillian Whyte beat him, meaning that Lewison qualified to fight for a world title at the time himself. But Dave Allen, despite being a much more recognisable name than Ian Lewison today in 2025, and possibly at that time as well, did not even qualify to fight for the British title at the point of fighting Dillian Whyte. That's why Ian Lewison is a decent tier world level win, and Dave Allen is not a world level win at all. So overall, Dillian Whyte has 11 world level wins. 10 of them came before he ever even fought for a world title, and 9 of them happened within one winning streak. And forget about how much these wins warrant a world title shot. Let's say Dillian Whyte was actually a world champion or was fighting for a world title against one of these guys. So the great wins here are guys that you would beat in a world title unification or a reigning world champion who you would dethrone. The good wins would be solid title defences or guys that you could beat in a vacant world title fight for sure. Definitely a vacant interim title fight, as the Rivas fight was literally that. And the decent wins would be subpar voluntary world title defences and even vacant interim title fights at a push. I say at a push, but it is very possible. I mean, Monty Barrett fought for the vacant WBC interim title against Hasim Rahman, and was Monty Barrett that much better than Jermaine Franklin is? I know I said I'll leave the comparing until after, but I'll be comparing Whyte to guys in his own era in that section. Now, to further break down Dillian Whyte's resume, I've categorised some of his wins into broad things that make the win somewhat impressive. I would have already mentioned these things, and a further breakdown would do more justice to some of these wins than what the categories would merely suggest, but I just want to have it all displayed on screen so we can compartmentalise this all. Okay, here it is. So we had an 11-fight winning streak in which he defeated these fighters in this particular order from top to bottom. Those impressive winning streaks that guys go on when they're meant to be fighting one guy for the title that whole time, but they end up fighting someone else before they get their due and get smoked. Imagine that happening to 2 of your favourite fighters across 2 different combat sports within the space of 3.5 months. I'm anti-fanboyism, but I was literally a kid at the time, so allow me. I was a fucking kid. We have former and future world champions here. Not only one of these have no asterisk over it, as you can see, that being Joseph Parker. Based on the thing alone about Parker just being a world champion 4 months before that fight with Whyte and losing his title in what was his only loss at the time, that makes the Parker win miles better than most guys' wins over an ex-world champions on their way to a world title. For instance, you got Arslanbek Makhmudov beat an ex-world champion in Samuel Peter, but Peter had 8 losses then and was 11 years removed from being a world champ. And there are many more examples of guys beating a washed-up ex-world champion who had lost several times since being a world champion on their way up. So Whyte's win over Parker is not a token, oh, he beat an ex-world champion. No, guys do not get wins over ex-world champions like this before fighting for a world title. Most guys get given washed-up ex-world champions, trust me. So Parker is all Dillian Whyte needs there in regards to wins over ex or future world champions on his resume. But as for the ones with an asterisk over it, Povetkin's got the asterisk as he was just a regular champion. Browne has 2 asterisks as he was just a regular champ and he got stripped of that belt for failing a drugs test, but his title reign is still recognised in the history books, which is why he's on here. And Rivas has an asterisk because he did become a world champion after losing to Dillian Whyte, but it was not in the heavyweight division. By the way, all these names for each category are in chronological order of when Dillian beat them. For former and future world title challengers, we've got Brian Minto, asterisk there because he was a former cruiserweight world title challenger. Both times Whyte beat Chisora. Chisora was a future and former world title challenger. He challenged for Vitaly Klitschko's WBC world title in 2012 and went on to challenge for Tyson Fury's WBC title in 2022. Lucas Browne, of course, challenged for that Reggie belt that he won, asterisk for the Reggie belt. Joseph Parker was a former world title challenger when he won the vacant WBO world title against Andy Ruiz. He also really ought to be down as a future world heavyweight title challenger, but that's neither here nor there. Again, Rivas, future Bridgerweight title challenger, won the thing. Mariusz Wach challenged for Vladimir Klitschko's 3 world titles, and the former WBA Reggie champ Povetkin has no asterisk here as he challenged for Vlad's unified titles too. And as for O's taken, we of course have Dave Allen, Lucas Browne, Oscar Rivas and Jermaine Franklin. That category is the smallest flex though, because most of Dillian Whyte's contemporaries have taken a good few O's as well. Now to look at the comparative side of things finally. I personally think that Dillian Whyte has the best resume before fighting for a world title than any other heavyweight ever. I know he had the 2 losses on his record before his world title opportunity, and there are circumstances that you could allude to in order to justify him not getting a world title shot, but anyway, in terms of me thinking that he has the best pre-world title fight resume, if we can call it that, in the heavyweight division, there's no point of me showing a list of heavyweights who got world title shots off of lesser wins on their record that Whyte had, or I'd literally put every heavyweight ever on there. But by the standards of his era, look, let's take a look at this great, good and decent world level wins list, and then let's look at how many guys in Whyte's era got world title shots off of mere decent wins. So Dillian Whyte's resume will automatically be miles better than these guys with all of the good and great wins that he had. Just a disclaimer, I know that getting world title shots are based off of rankings and politics and being in the right place at the right time when belts get vacated or what have you, so I'm not saying that Whyte should have had these guys as world title shots instead of them or anything. I'm just proving the point of you could call Whyte's wins overrated, and you could have been someone who was tired of hearing him beg for a world title shot, but guys in his era got world title shots off of way lesser wins. In regards to Dillian Whyte's era, we're talking mid-2010s up until the early 2020s by the way. So here are the guys that got world title shots in Dillian Whyte's era that didn't even have a good tier win. Just decent tier wins. We have Alex Leapai, Bermane Stiverne, Eric Molina twice, Charles Martin, Dominic Brazeale twice, Gerald Rossington, Razvan Kajanu and Hughie Fury. And for honourable mentions, as in guys who just about have a good tier world level win but they are arguable, we have Johan Duhaupas, Vyacheslav Glazkov, Artur Spilkar and Daniel Dubois. Yes, Daniel Dubois. I probably should throw Carlos Takam on there as well. So Alex Leapai, he got a shot at Vladimir Klitschko's unified WBA, IBF and WBO titles in April of 2014. I know this was a bit before Dillian Whyte's time of being world level, but this isn't his era and we're holding this all to the standards of his era all round. So Leapai just had not beaten anyone. He of course would have had technically decent wins to get a world title shot, that being wins against guys who there are nothing else to say about other than that they are world ranked. Leapai would have probably beaten a couple of WBO top 15 guys to get the world title shot, but again, no good wins there, definitely not. And if you want to use the fact that Dillian Whyte had that loss to AJ which brought down his resume and his world title hopes when he was on that winning streak, well Leapai had 4 losses and 3 draws and he had beaten nobody at the point of challenging for the unified titles. Next up, Bermane Stiverne. He rematched Chris Arreola for the vacant WBC title on the line just 2 weeks after Alex Leapai challenged Klitschko. We're still in the dark era at this stage. So this was still a bit before Dillian Whyte's world level days. This vacant WBC title fight was a rematch from when Stiverne beat Arreola for the WBC silver title a year prior. Arreola was decent of course, but the vacant title shot came within the duology of Arreola. If we look at what he did before the Arreola fight, Stiverne just had a couple of those gimme world level wins in 2011, and he had a loss and a draw on his record too. And Stiverne actually was a world champion, let alone a world title challenger, as he beat Arreola in that rematch. And of course Stiverne didn't successfully defend his world title once. He is the guy who Deontay Wilder won his WBC title from, the same Wilder who held the belt for all that time and Dillian couldn't get a shot at him. Eric Molina next up. What do you know? First guy to challenge for Deontay Wilder's WBC title after Wilder won that title off of Stiverne. Molina had nothing but a couple of gimme world ranked wins, and he was having a couple of 6 and 8 rounders in his last few fights, at the point of challenging for the title. Not championship level stuff. And he had 2 losses on his record. And then after losing that shot to Wilder of course, Molina challenged for AJ's IBF heavyweight title just a year and a half later. Between the loss to Wilder and the shot at AJ, Molina beat a literal journeyman in a 6th rounder and a 39-year-old Thomas Adamek who had already been knocked off by a couple of heavyweight contenders. To be fair, Adamek is Adamek, so that could be deemed a good win and put Molina's 2nd world title shot as just an honourable mention in terms of guys who only have decent tier wins, but I can't be asked to put the same guy in 2 different sections. Charles Martin now. Much like Bermane Stiverne, this guy was actually a world champion, let alone a world title challenger. He won the vacant IBF heavyweight title against Vyacheslav Glazkov in underwhelming fashion. Glazkov just got injured in that fight and had to quit. And in defense number 1, Martin got stopped by Anthony Joshua in 2 rounds. Now before that vacant title fight against Glazkov, Charles Martin beat Vicente Sanders, who I'd find it hard to believe was world ranked. And before that, Martin beat Tom Dallas, a guy who everyone beats. Dallas might have been world ranked at the time that Martin beat him, but Dallas was coming off of a loss to Ian Lewison. Yes, Ian Lewison. So the win that probably had a big part in lining Charles Martin up for a vacant title shot was over a guy who was coming off of a loss to a guy who is probably Dillian Whyte's 10th or 11th best win or something. So here are those levels I'm talking about, of Dillian Whyte's record being incomparably better than the record of those guys who got a world title shot in his era. Before the Tom Dallas win, Martin did beat a few other guys who everyone beats. 1 or 2 of them may have been borderline world ranked at the time. And forget about guys you could beat to get a world title shot. The guy who Charles Martin fought in his world title shot in Vyacheslav Glazkov was not better than any of those good tier wins on Dillian Whyte's record who brought Whyte nowhere close to a world title fight. Dominic Brazeale now. When he was challenging for Anthony Joshua's IBF title, he was coming off of wins over Fred Cassie and Amir Mansour. I don't see how Fred Cassie could have been world ranked as he never won a fight scheduled for more than 8 rounds. Cassie never even won a fight at mediocre level, so I guess Amir Mansour was Brazile's only decent level win. And Brazeale did have the Devin Vargas win from a couple years prior. Obviously Vargas is a guy now with like 20 odd losses, but Vargas only had 3 losses when Brazeale fought him. But see, this is the territory we're in, trying to justify these shit borderline world level wins. Then we look at Whyte's wins. Of course, all of these wins but Jermaine Franklin happening before he fought for a world title. And if you want to consider the fashion of victory for the resume, well, Brazeale got the shot at AJ after a win over a 43-year-old Amir Mansour. I know Mansour boxed on until an old age as he missed out of 9 years of his pro career because he was in the joint, but he was only a decent tier win anyway, aside from age. And when Brazeale fought Mansour, Mansour was mashing him up and completely getting the better of the action. He dropped Brazeale in the 3rd round. Brazeale looked lethargic, stumbling about the place, still getting beaten up. But Mansour quit after the 5th round because he must have accidentally bit his own tongue. So yeah, shit win for Brazeale, and that's what he got a world title shot off of. Brazeale did the reverse of Eric Molina, got the shot at AJ's IBF title first, then a shot at Wilder's WBC title after, and he went on a 3-fight winning streak between the loss to AJ and the shot at Wilder, including a win over Eric Molina himself. The Molina win could arguably be considered a good world level win. So yeah, Brazeale's 2nd world title shot could be in the honourable mentions and all, with the debatable good level win. But deep it, when Brazeale challenged for Deontay Wilder's WBC title in 2019 with his best win being over John Molina, Dillian Whyte was the WBC #1 contender at the time with wins over Joseph Parker, Lucas Browne, Dereck Chisora twice and Robert Helenius. So we're talking about a mad difference in objective meritocracy here. And Whyte was still deprived of a title shot. Gerald Washington, he got the shot at Wilder's WBC title off of a win over Ray Austin, who was 1-3 in his last 4 at the point of fighting Washington. All 3 of those losses for Austin came by way of stoppage. And before that, Washington did beat Eddie Chambers, but this was an 8-rounder, and all of Chambers' last 7 fights at that point were 6 or 8 rounders, so Chambers weren't world level at that point. Washington getting the shot at Wilder, baby ting. Razvan Kajanu next up. He challenged for Joseph Parker's WBO title in 2017. Now this is a right place at the right time thing. I know Kajanu was a short notice replacement, but the fact is that he did get a world title shot. Kajanu was coming off of a win over Ji Yu Wu, which would have just scraped Kajanu a WBO ranking. Ji Yu Wu was coming off of a loss to Ian Lewison when Kajanu beat him. And lastly, we have Hughie Fury, who also challenged for Parker's WBO title in 2017, and this was off of a win over Fred Cassie, who hadn't won any of his last 3 fights at that point. Hughie had a couple other decent tier wins, but I'm not asked to break it down at this point. So both Hughie Fury and Razvan Kajanu got shots at Joseph Parker's WBO World Heavyweight title in 2017. And going into the year 2017, Whyte already had a better resume than both Fury and Kajanu with his wins over Ian Lewison and Dereck Chisora in 2016. Stuff like this is why people say that Dillian Whyte should have gone the WBO route. On that note now, one wouldn't say that Dillian Whyte had a legendary career as he wasn't a world champion. But what if you had the exact same resume but you just stuck a world title shot next to those wins? Would it look any better? Because some of Whyte's fights were bigger than some world title fights of that era were. Now based on all of those guys who we just spoke about getting world title shots with mere decent tier wins, we really could just stick a world title next to Dillian Whyte's name as far back as 2016. But let's not even go that far back. Let's say that when Dillian Whyte fought Joseph Parker in 2018, that fight was for the WBO World Heavyweight title. Let's say Parker never lost the belt to AJ before fighting Whyte, or AJ had to vacate for some reason and this one was for the vacant title. Dillian Whyte would have won the world title off of Joseph Parker in that case, and he would have defended it against Dereck Chisora, Oscar Rivas, Mariusz Wach, I know the Wach fight was a 10-rounder, so in theory I can't imagine it to be a world title fight, but it's not like Wach would have chinned Whyte in the championship round, so let's count it. And that would be 3 title defences. Again, against Chisora, Rivas and Wach. Then when he lost to Povetkin, he would have lost his world title to him. Then when he beat Povetkin in a rematch, he would have become a 2-time world champion. Can I get a 2-time? Then he would have in theory lost to Fury in a unification. So Whyte would have been a 2-time world heavyweight champion with 3 successful title defences in his first reign. Yeah, shoulda, woulda, coulda, but I'm just putting into perspective that Whyte's resume is world championship worthy. His wins were better than certain guys' world title defences. This guy has a better overall body of wins than many heavyweights who were actually world champions of all time. In his era, you've got Bermane Stiverne and Charles Martin, who he definitely had better careers than. Then when you look to the past, you could say that Whyte's body of work is better than the likes of Bruce Seldon, better than some champions who, had no successful title defences like Harry Coetzee. And then there are arguments for Whyte having a better resume than certain reigning and defending world champions of the past, but it gets a bit techie there. But to look at the honourable mentions again for the guys who got world title shots off of mid-decent tier wins here, Johan Duhaupas had the one just about good tier win against Manuel Charr going into his shot at Deontay Wilder. And Duhaupas actually lost his fight before the Charr fight. Vyacheslav Gazkov, when he fought Martin for the vacant IBF title, he had 2 borderline good wins on his resume in Steve Cunningham and Thomas Adamek, who both weren't at the best stages of their careers when Gazkov beat them. But Cunningham was on a 3-fight winning streak at least. And Adamek...
You know what? That was a good win for Gazkov.
Adamek was on a good run since his loss to Vitali Klitschko. That one for Gazkov is probably on the level of those 5 good tier wins for Dillian Whyte. So for the time, Gazkov getting the vacant title shot off of a win over Thomas Adamek was fair. He was actually the favourite over Charles Martin in that vacant title fight who, as we've established, has no good tier wins. Artur Szpilka now took on Deontay Wilder for his WBC title on the same night as Martin vs Gazkov for the IBF title. Wilder vs Szpilka was the main event of that card. Now Szpilka was coming off of a win over Thomas Adamek as well, and Adamek coming off of the loss to Gazkov, but we'll still allow this as a good tier win for Szpilka, just about. And Daniel Dubois finally. Yes, going into the rematch of Alexander Usyk for undisputed gold, Dubois had wins over Jarrell Miller, Filip Hrgovic and Anthony Joshua. But going into his first shot at Usyk's unified titles in 2023, Dubois' best wins on paper were the 2 wins he was coming off, over Kevin Lerena and Trevor Bryant. Both of these wins are good tier wins when you look into them, but you do have to make quite the case for both the Lerena and the Bryant wins being good tier wins, hence why Dubois is in the honourable mentions section. And you could even put the fashion of victory asterisk over Dubois vs Lerena like we did for Dominic Brazeale vs Amir Mansour. But we don't need to break down that Dubois vs Lerena fight here. So yeah, this is a list of guys who Dillian Whyte's resume was just miles better than when he got a world title shot than these guys' resumes were when they got their world title shots. And as for Dillian Whyte's not being undefeated, well, less than half of the names on screen got their first world title shot while being undefeated. And by the way, this list does not even include guys who challenged for the WBA regular title, nor the lineal world heavyweight title without a belt being on the line. Those might not be considered proper world title shots anyway, but Dillian Whyte never challenged for those honours. So I really should start to wrap up now. I just wanted to give a breakdown on the level of wins that Dillian Whyte gained before fighting for a world title. Because if they don't seem that impressive on the surface, when you compare it to other people's record, you realise that putting together that body of wins in the heavyweight division without being a world champion is unforeseen. I'm not here to call Dillian Whyte a great boxer, and I'm not here to say that he would have been able to beat AJ in a rematch or Deontay Wilder if he got a shot at them while he was on his winning streak. So why bother yap about the fact that he never got a world title shot against them then? Well, look at some of those guys who did get shots at AJ and Wilder respectively. Dillian Whyte would have been a liver opponent than a good few of them. Dillian Whyte is not the nicest boxer. He has good ring IQ, good strategy, and uses the right techniques to carry out his strategy for the most part, but his technique in itself is far from clean. But he had 7 amateur fights, as he says in every interview. I had 7 amateur fights. And at least he did put on fun fights for us. And most of all, it was that body of wins that this video is based on that made people rally behind Dillian Whyte. It doesn't matter how he looked in victory and how minute you reckon his chances were against the sitting champions at the time, his record is undeniable. Yes, when Dillian Whyte finally got his title shot, he got put down with relative ease by Tyson Fury, and that led to Whyte's detractors talking about how shit Whyte was all along. And yeah, that's fine, but he still deserved the title shot with the wins he had. And Whyte probably did have more of a chance against Deontay Wilder for that WBC title, the fight he was chasing, than he had against Tyson Fury. Deep it, Dillian Whyte's first world title shot was against Tyson Fury, but AJ's first world title shot was against Charles Martin, and Wilder's was against Bermane Stiverne. So there is a world where Dillian Whyte had an easier road to a world title for sure. The fact that he put all of those wins together until slipping on the banana skin in the form of Aleksander Povetkin.
Sasha Povetkin.
Then after avenging that loss, he walked into a title shot against Tyson Fury, not the champion he was chasing for all those years, having been knocked out 2 fights ago, and he gets chinned by Fury in that title fight, so now he was shit all along and should be embarrassed for having ever called for a world title shot. Even though heavyweights in his era got world title shots who are not even as good themselves as Dillian Whyte's like 9th and 10th best wins. It's a bit harsh in my opinion. Yeah, shoulda, woulda, coulda, and he came unstuck when he had his chance, but that body of work before the world title shot is something else, man. Maybe he would have got knocked out against any sitting champion in a world title fight. Maybe he was on borrowed time all along with his lack of amateur experience. Perhaps he never had the makings of a varsity athlete, but he was beyond deserving of a world title shot when he got one. Now, I know this is not the greatest flex, and does not in theory put Dillian Whyte anywhere near the top 20 or 25 or 30 heavyweight boxers of all time, but right now I stand on the fact that Dillian Whyte has the best resume at heavyweight before getting a shot at the world heavyweight title. Some might find that fact embarrassing, that he can never do the business outside of the ring to wriggle his way into a title shot. But for that little bit of heavyweight trivia, the question of who got the best wins pre-world title shot of all time, Dillian Whyte takes the cake for me. In modern boxing history at least. We're talking the last 50 odd years. When you go as far back as the 60s, I do know all of the champions, but I'm not familiar with each of the contenders and stuff. Most of the greatest heavyweights of all time of course get world title shots while undefeated, and they got the title shots without getting any massive wins because we could see how good they were from the off. They just had to be pushed to the top. There was no need for them to go on some career arc before their world title shot. So me saying that Dillian Whyte has a better resume than the likes of Mike Tyson did before getting a world title shot doesn't mean that Whyte holds anything over on Mike Tyson. It just means that Whyte's in the lead for that obscure piece of trivia that only an omega male like me would care about. I was considering doing a video in which I rank the heavyweights that have the best pre-world title fight resume, but yeah, that is a pretty obscure video concept. And off the top of my head right now, the top 3 would just be Dillian Whyte, Riddick Bowe, and Joe Joyce, in that particular order. I haven't broken it down or really put mad thought into it yet, that's just off the dome. But I don't see myself coming to any conclusion other than that right now. So I'll have to do the research to see if this which heavyweight has the best pre-world title fight resume video is even worth making. Anyway, thanks for making it to this point in the video, and you have been listening to O.M.E. Boxing.